Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's virtual offering of the Library Assessment Conference. Today's presentations are on the theme of teaching and learning and value. My name is Megan Oakleaf, and I am the moderator for today's session. My colleague, Clara Maidenberg, is my co-moderator, and before we begin, we have a few logistics to go over. We have 11 presentations with 2 breaks, one after the first 4 presentations and another after the next 4. Break times are 2:20 p.m. Eastern and 4 p.m. Eastern. For those of you on a different time zone, the time is currently 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Each paper presentation will be introduced separately with up to 5 minutes of Q&A for each paper. There will be a few minutes for general questions at the end of the entire session. Please use the chat feature for technical questions and issues, and an ARL staff member will respond. Please use the Q&A feature to ask questions of the speakers. Note that we may not be able to address all questions during the time allowed, but we will have a few minutes at the end of all presentations to address any additional questions. Questions will be read aloud for the audience and answered live by the presenter. After the individual Q&A, presenters may also type answers to any unanswered questions in the live time. If you're a Twitter user, please follow the hashtag LAC20. The PowerPoint slides, session recordings, and the final edited conference papers will be made available on the conference website. This session is being recorded and will be posted to the conference website as well. Live captioning is enabled for this webinar. Please hit the CC button at the bottom of your screen to turn on captions. A full transcript will accompany the recording about a week or 2 after the event. Our first paper is The Collective, Assessing a Statewide Training Program on Library Impact, presented by Lisa Janicki Hinchliffe, who holds the rank of professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and Karen Brown, who is a professor at Dominican University.
Great, thank you, Megan. And welcome to everyone to this afternoon of the Library Assessment Conference. I'm pleased to be here today with my colleague Karen Brown at Dominican University, who has been the evaluator on our Carly Counts project. Our presentation today is really looking at this question of how do you look at statewide impact of a training program, in addition to the impact of the training program itself on the participants. So we'll go on to the next slide, and just my role here today will be to situate our talk within the context of Carly Counts itself, because we do think you need to know a little bit about the program in order to understand what we're faced with as our evaluative challenge. We also want to give a thanks to the PI on this project, Anne Craig at the Carly office. And Carly is the Consortium of Academic and Research Libraries in Illinois. And the website for Carly Counts is easily findable, but also displayed here on the screen. Next slide. Carly Counts is a 3-year IMLS-funded continuing education leadership immersion program. It has the goal of preparing librarians to make effective use of the research findings in the literature on the impact of academic libraries on student learning and success, building on the work that, of course, I started with Megan while we were in our respective roles, as myself as president of ACRL and Megan as our contracted researcher. Our goal here is the twin purposes of service development, helping libraries be better, and library advocacy, telling our story of how great we are. Participants are learning to use local library data analytics to improve their services, demonstrate their value in the competitive campus budgeting processes, accreditation reports, and program reviews that they find themselves in. And of course, this has all turned out to be so much more relevant in the time of the pandemic, as our members are facing even more challenging budgetary environments. Next slide. The Carly Counts deliverables from the IMLS grant overall is a portfolio of our local case studies from every institution that participated in the Carly Counts training program, as well as posters from each of the teams that the individual members were organized into. All of these are available on the Carly Counts website at this point. In addition, there's an evaluation of the collective statewide impact of the program. When you do this kind of intensive professional development within a state, do we see effects that are more than on just the institution itself? And then, of course, we're offering this training model out at the end of our 3 years, or what will now be 4 with a grant extension, an OER package so that other states, regions, et cetera, could replicate this model if they wanted to. Next slide. So our idea here is very grounded in the notion of community of practice. This notion that we are developing a community of practice across Illinois academic and research libraries. And that is groups of people who share a concern or a passion for something they do. So we already evaluate our library services. We already have to tell our story. But we learn to do it better by interacting regularly. So we're looking to improve our practice through our community connections. Next slide. So what was our collective experience? And as the co-PI on the Carly Counts grant, this has been my primary role, which is to oversee the development of the training program and then to be the lead facilitator of this training. So the structure of participants in each year has been that they have a peer-to-peer learning environment in their teams that is also part of this larger community of practice of those participating in a given year, which is part of a larger community practice of people who have participated across any year of the grant, which of course is a subset of all of our members of the Carly Consortium. Each year there, we call it a cohort, and that cohort is comprised of multiple teams. Each team has 5 members and 1 mentor. There's so much more we could say about this structure and the like, but that's not our focus here today. Direct you to some of our other presentations and reports if you want to dig in more to the structure of the program. The people in the learning program have this immersive experience that took place over the course of February through November, with their final report due in the following January. So there are 2 3-day immersive workshops that are held on site, except in the pandemic, in which the last one was then held on Zoom in February and July. We have webinars that punctuate the months in between the immersive on-site in-person experiences, as well as team meetings that are held regularly, in some teams as often as weekly. So this is really at their discretion, led by the mentors. And then a poster session at the Carly annual meeting in November about their team experience, with their individual reports due, as I mentioned, the following January. In year 3, because we have an extension to offer this, we will be moving to, at least for the first parts, a Zoom only experience until we can move back to in-person. But so we're pivoting and flexing as we all are these days. So we're evolving as well through the course of this project due to the demand and interest of our members, from projects that are done at individual institutions to single projects that are undertaken by teams of individuals from multiple institutions. So in the first year of our program, we had 8 teams of individuals. In the second year of our program, we had 6 teams of individuals, by which I mean every person is working on their own project on their own campus. And then we were approached by a group who said, we want to do a project together. And always wanting to respond to that sort of innovative strategy, we were like, all right, we'll figure out how to make that work. So we have one collaborative team project where they are doing an investigation across the Carly Consortium, done by 5 people working as a team. In cohort 3, which is now our 3rd year of the program of the intensive training, we are going to have, we don't know how many yet, a collaborative project teams approach. So we're going to shift all the way over to collaborative projects and see what that looks like. We received a no cost extension from IMLS. And so we're able to do 1 more year of training. And then in that 4th year now, we'll have the open educational research package that we mentioned. So this is a very high level overview of like the way the program's structured and the way it's evolving. So I'm going to turn it over now to Karen, who will give us a look at, okay, so how has she been evaluating this experience?
Thanks, Lisa. So I've really been in the fortunate position of being a fly on the wall, so to speak, and watch the process unfold. My primary role is to capture the learning that is occurring and the experiences of the participants and the members, the participants and the mentors in this kind of team-based approach. So how are we doing that? We have some online participant surveys. So for each of the two cohorts, we've gone through two cohorts at this point, there have been a total of 3 online surveys of the participants. There is a survey at the start of the project before they actually get involved at all. After the first in-person workshop, which is about 1/3 of the way into the year-long program, and then at the conclusion of the project, after they have submitted their reports. We've also been doing what we call rapid workshop evaluations. So at the conclusion of each day of the in-person workshop, and then we also did it when we held it virtually with the second cohort, we asked the participants to just do a rapid evaluation designed to help us understand what are they finding exciting, beneficial. What do they have concerns about? And if they have any other comments or concerns or questions that they want to share with us each day so that we can kind of quickly respond and adapt as we need to. I'm also doing mentor interviews, interviewing each of the mentors so that we can really gain an understanding how the mentors are seeing the project and their own growth in terms of personally and professionally, how they're thinking about the role of their role as a mentor maybe has changed from the start of the project to the end of the project, and suggestions that they would have for future mentors of a project such as this. In terms of what we've learned about participants' familiarity and experience using data, both to measure the impact of academic libraries on student success, and in order to develop services and programs that promote the library contribution to their institutions' priorities. We're also interested in participants' experience with team-based learning and how their experience of it and perception of it during the project may be changing. And when we get this information throughout the project, we've been using it to support the learning that's occurring for the participants, and also using it to change or intervene or provide support for the cohort experience, either at the team level or the kind of cohort as an entity itself. Regarding learning about evidence-based practices, we identified from the start 13 core practices that are critical to evidence-based work in libraries. And at the start of the project, and then after the first workshop, and then again at the end of the project, we've asked each participant to rate on a scale of 1 to 5, from strongly disagree to strongly agree, plus having some other short open-ended questions about their understanding of evidence-based practices. And with the first cohort, we've completed all of that evaluation. We're in the process with the second cohort. But the top 5 areas of growth in terms of from the start of the project to the end of the project really was in some of the specifics related to doing action research, identifying research variables, measuring research variables, determining data collection methods, IRB human subjects protocols. As you can imagine, each institution really handles it differently. And so there was a lot of kind of understanding at a kind of foundational level, what is this? And then helping the participants at their own institutions working through that IRB protocol, and then also identifying data needs. In terms of team interaction and communication, Participants really have been satisfied with the cohort communication. In fact, they even want more. And what it seems, we haven't had a chance to look closely at the cohort 2 data yet, but cohort 2, particularly because they moved into kind of a virtual world to complete their projects, really seem to value this communication within not only the cohort, but as a team. They are finding that working with cohort members and as a team is energizing. And with the first cohort, more than 65% of the participants report increased confidence about their use of using evidence-based practices, library leadership, and advocacy as a result of the team experience, not just being part of Carly Counts as a, as a learning initiative, but the actual team experience has increased their confidence. So as we begin to develop a third cohort, we also are increasingly interested in the kind of collective impact of the project. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts kind of perspective. And collective impact is different from collaboration. Because collective impact initiatives typically have a backbone entity of some sort that provides centralized infrastructure, provides staff, and a structured process that propels the individual sectors or the individual groups participating in the initiative, propels them on a common agenda. Now, the Stanford Social Innovation Review has published quite a bit over the last several years about collective impact, and they have a chart that I find particularly useful that contrasts isolated impact and collective impact. And if we look at this, I've underlined these, the underlining is my emphasis. If we look at the Carly Counts project, there are so many aspects, features of it that really align nicely with this notion of collective impact. First, Carly is that backbone entity that I referred to a minute ago, and Carly Counts is based on the participation of the Carly members. The participating Carly Counts institutions are all focused on this goal and measuring the same thing. In other words, learning how to document and advocate for library impact on student learning and success. And Carly Counts has a cross-section alignment because Illinois higher education institutions of all types are involved. Community colleges, small and medium-sized colleges and universities, and large research universities, as well as both public and private institutions. And at its essence, Carly Counts is a learning initiative, as Lisa was explaining. So as we enter this third year, we have increasingly reached out to sectors outside the library world for their input, for their recommendations, including talking with state higher education boards, as well as some higher education agencies. And finally, Carly Counts project is structured such that the participating institutions coordinate their activities and reports of lessons learned about evidence-based practices. The individual institutions are taking incremental steps towards this collective goal. They're documenting how they're using data to measure impact. The project activities of Carly Counts foster reciprocal relationships among the individual institutions, and the individual institutions are learning how and using data and analytics to investigate the impact of the library. And this is a vested institution, not only of the individual institutions, but also the participating institutions, but also the statewide network of academic libraries. Now, cohort 3, as Lisa explained, is really kind of moving more from assessment of library impact at individual institutions to multiple institutions working in teams, each team focusing on a different topic. And this shift kind of presents an opportunity for us to approach the project evaluation a little bit differently. We are still developing the evaluation plans, but we're going to be looking at it and tweaking it a bit differently. We're still going to be administering the 3 surveys to cohort 3, but we will also look to see maybe are there some differences in the learning that occurred, the way that they apply evidence-based practices that are a little different in cohort 3 from maybe cohorts 1 and 2. And also, obviously, these year-end team project reports are going to provide information about the multi-institutional collaborative approach and what can we learn from it being more of a kind of multiple institutions working together. We also want to go back to cohorts 1 and 2. We want to find out about assessment activities since the conclusion of Carly Counts. In other words, has it been sustained what the evidence-based practices? The librarians' perceptions, the participating librarians' perceptions of ways that maybe awareness and understanding of using data to document library impact has changed at their individual libraries, among the staff at their libraries, as well as the librarians' perceptions of their leadership role regarding evidence-based practices at the library and on their campus. So as the project has unfolded, it's really been an increasingly layered, iterative process of individual institutions working collectively with that backbone entity of Carly to learn about evidence-based practices and to apply them. So that's a nutshell, in a snapshot of how we're this interesting project and how we're looking at it in terms of at individual institutions as well as a statewide collective effort.
Thank you, Karen and Lisa. So for all of you out there, if you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A box and I'll read them for the entire audience. I do have one question to start with. Can you share, Karen and Lisa, some of the collective barriers that your participants encountered in their efforts to use data about impact?
So I think, I don't know if I want to frame it as a barrier, but I think there's sort of 2 things that we're confirming in this as far as curricularly, which is there is both skill development and confidence development. And so most people are facing a need to develop in both areas. And so I think anyone working on this work has to really think about both of these aspects. And I think that's borne out in the evidence that Karen has from her evaluations that people are gaining in both skills and confidence.
Right. And I think I would add to that an example that has come up in both of the 2 cohorts is this understanding that you need to reach out on your campuses to work with institutional research, or for the IRB that you can leverage what's available on your campus, but also learning how to communicate that the library can also contribute data that might be used by other entities on campus and vice versa. So building those partnerships on a campus, I think, has been a learning curve for many of the participants.
So another, that's great. Another question that we have is about the sunburst image. Can you talk about the development of that, or the origin with the process? Yeah, it's purple and beautiful. That one, yep.
Yes. It was when the curriculum, and Lisa can add in here, but when the project was initially designed and a curriculum was being developed, it really focused on what are the core competencies that are needed to be able to kind of use evidence-based practices and then to advocate for the library on the campus. And so when you look at the curriculum, they're not presented as 13 separate modules, but there are 13 kind of practices that are in some ways, maybe I should have arrows going both ways, but that are really more interactive in terms of the kind of gestalt, so to speak, of what needs to be learned for evidence-based practices. Does that answer the question you were going after?
Yeah, I think it does, and I love your insight onto the arrows. Right, it might be like
It's
an
too late.
evidence-based practice tornado,
Right, right.
rather than yeah, that's
Yeah,
great. That's fantastic. That's very helpful.
yeah,
Thank you, Lisa and Karen. That was a great
sure.
presentation. Next up, we'll be
Thank
sharing
you.
you bet. Next up, we'll be sharing a recording of Focusing on the Forest, Not Just Leaves, when preparing faculty for and assessing online course and curriculum design, presented by Erin Noland, the Assistant Dean for Strategy and Development at James Madison University. Erin is unable to make it here today live, so we won't have a Q&A, but we will share any questions that you have with him.
I don't understand.
Development at the JMU libraries. And this presentation is done in conjunction with, in partnership with my colleague, the head of online learning at JMU libraries, Qiong Christy Liu. And so today we're going to talk about our online course and curriculum design institute that we have at JMU. So we're talking here today about focusing on the forest, not just the leaves. A little brief overview of the presentation as we start. First, we'll talk a little bit about what online teaching efficacy is. We'll talk about the Institute for Online and Hybrid Teaching at JMU and how it is structured. We'll talk about how we structured our research design, scaled the Institute, and engaged in data collection. And I'll provide some preliminary data analysis, feedback, and sort of some data-based adjustments that Christy and her team are making to the Institute. And we'll conclude with a kind of look to the future. What can we learn from this? So efficacy, a quick overview and framework for understanding where we're going today. I know many of you are familiar with the term self-efficacy and may even have done some extensive work with it in your training. But just to give a background, Bandura and many since have defined self-efficacy as somebody's self-beliefs or beliefs about themselves related to their ability to succeed in a particular setting or in engaging in a particular behavior. So it's important to really know that this is domain specific. And when I talk about this, I think about my ability, my self-efficacy about my ability to maybe deliver a presentation might be relatively high. My self-efficacy about being able to fix my car is incredibly low. So confidence is a general term that spans domains, self-efficacy a narrower term that is domain specific. And why self-efficacy? Well, self-efficacy is important for a number of reasons we'll talk about over the course of the presentation today, but self-efficacy is highly influential on future attempts at and success with target behavior. So the higher my self-efficacy, the more likely I am to try something and the more likely I am to succeed at that specific behavior or in that specific setting. So how do we actually engage in an increase in self-efficacy? Our talk today is about preparing faculty for online and hybrid teaching situations. So if we're using an efficacy framework, you'd be right to assume that we're trying to increase efficacy related to this behavior in this setting. So the first way, the most basic way, is verbal persuasion. Somebody cheering you on, somebody encouraging you, somebody telling you that you can succeed in a specific area. And really here, what we're talking about is motivation. Right? So how verbal persuasion can increase your motivation and your sense of efficacy as a result. The second one is managing our stress and anxiety and how they manifest emotionally and physiologically. So you may have done mindfulness or something along those lines and recognize how it both reduces your stress and anxiety and simultaneously may increase sort of this positive affect that you have. And so managing stress and anxiety can help us increase our efficacy. Vicarious experience, we live vicariously through others. That's what this is discussing. So if I see a peer experience success with a target behavior, then it's likely to increase my belief that I can succeed in that space also. It's important to note here as we talk about vicarious experience that a peer must be a similar peer. So I can't see a mechanic fix my car and think that I can do it. But if I see somebody who I know has very little experience fixing cars, no training in fixing cars, and they're able to do something, say like change a tire, then I might feel like I could do the same. I could succeed with that behavior as well. And finally, the most effective way at increasing efficacy is an active attainment, that I actually engage in and succeed at a specific target behavior, which is why our self-efficacy is highest amongst the things that we are most experienced and expert at doing. So these are the primary ways that efficacy can be increased. So if we apply efficacy to online teaching, it's domain specific, so we need to sort of specify what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is faculty participant beliefs about their ability to teach effectively in an online environment. So this is a faculty development institute, and that's how we've defined online teaching efficacy. And the institute is structured to address a set of core target behaviors that are consistent with best practices in online teaching. So our theory of change, quite simply, is faculty efficacy should increase as faculty are provided with expert instruction and support aimed at increasing their motivation to succeed. That's verbal persuasion. They're learning from peers who are also in the institute, or maybe who have gone through the institute before, who are expert online teachers, who are successfully teaching online. That's vicarious experience. They are applying course design principles to their own classes. So they're actually putting what they're learning in the institute into their course that they're teaching. That's an active attainment. And hopefully through the proper support all along the continuum, they have that emotional, physical stress and anxiety reduced as their efficacy is increased. So this is how we've conceptualized the construct of online teaching. So the objectives of the Online Institute, there are a number of them. I'm going to buzz through them quickly here, encourage you to pause and take a look should you want to dig in. We start with revisiting learning theories in online environments, so contextualizing learning theory in the online environment. We use, the people who lead the Institute are instructional designers, so they develop an understanding of instructional design principles and how we can really foster interactivity and connection in online environments. Faculty members should be able to identify strategies that optimally support student success in online learning by the conclusion. To develop skill sets of teaching with technologies, and that's intentionally broad because the technologies that people use are variant. We hang these on pedagogy and assessment strategies, just like face-to-face learning is hung on pedagogy and assessment strategies. And at the end of the course, at the end of the institute, faculty members should have a syllabus and the core structure of their class and be able to identify what best practices led them to make a specific decision, and have you revisit should you like to, because the point of today's presentation is from here forward. So the design scale and COVID. So we started with fall 2019 is when we talked about changing this and using the efficacy framework. And our plan was to use pre and post test instruments, to do some qualitative on the back end, gather artifacts from people, and do some institute feedback and assessment. Then COVID happened. And in the summer, we were faced with the need to help the campus scale for what we felt like was going to be a hybrid, high flex, online, or some combination of that in the fall. And so the Institute went from a cohort model of 12 people to over 300 participants over a summer. And so we shifted our focus to still do the pre and post test. The pre and post are about efficacy. We'll talk about that in a second. But we were in this emergency faculty develop model with some pressure from the institution as well. But we did also want to gather some assessment data. So what do? We use the mixed method design. The instruments are the online teaching efficacy scale that was used pre and post, with 5 open-ended qualitative questions, gathering course artifacts, which are things that faculty participants produce. So maybe an assignment, a syllabus, an introduction to a course, a discussion board activity, any number of those sort of things. We also use the online learning community and presence scale. And that scale is about the faculty participants and their experience in the Institute. And finally, we gathered some instructional design and organization feedback. So the Scaled Institute Self-Efficacy pre and post test data for this scale, for the online teaching efficacy scale. This is a 21 item Likert type question survey. And you can see here some sample questions. Unfortunately, fortunately, the pretest, we have 55 participants. That's great. And here you can see the means across the questions. On the post-test, we only had 9 people. And, you know, COVID happened, the Institute was ending as fall semester was starting, and it was a crazy time. And so we didn't really feel like, you know, trying to ratchet up the response rate with so much else going on. So we're not talking here about statistically significant comparisons, but you can see over the course of this, things for the 55 and the 11, the means did go up. Again, not a statistically significant comparison, just showing here the data that we gathered. The online learning community and presence scale is 8 questions about how people interact with others and with the instructors or facilitators in the Institute. And you can see nine people filled this out. This was a post only. And so you see relatively moderate scores across the 8 items. And this is the assessment data that we gathered. So how people went through, how people experienced going through the Institute. We'll come back to this in a second. Some highlights from the instructional design and organization scale. And this is a 6 item Likert type about the instructors. How did the facilitators, the instructors, do their expertise, their communication, their interaction with participants. And you can see some variance over this one. The graph scale makes it look like more than there is. So some qualitative feedback that came on the back end as well. So feedback themes were about pacing and sequencing and the lack of an ability to select specific models. So the cohort model, people step through each module together, and it's over 15 weeks over the course of a year or a semester, depending on how the Institute is structured for that year. And so we applied that same approach in the summer scaled 300-person plus Institute, and people really expressed some dislike for that they didn't like the fact that they couldn't go in and get access to the specific module that they thought most applied to themselves. They had to work through the whole course to get there. So an exemplary comment talks about not having the time to go through the whole course and really wanting to be able to jump in and out of topics because they had to go through everything. So more of a menu type where you can pick the topics that you're interested and dig in on those. So what do we do with that feedback? Well, the first thing that we did was not do anything too significant because this Institute was scaled in a matter of weeks. It's been a hallmark program. It's worked really well. And we were in an emergency. We had a university, the university mandated people to do professional development related to online learning ahead of the fall semester. And we had a really low response rate. So we wanted to make sure that we kept those things front of mind. But the feedback theme of pacing, self-selection, and sequencing seemed to be legitimate. And so one of the implemented changes as a result of that is that we switched the Institute to be fully asynchronous, and the sequencing requirements were removed. So you could drop in and grab things that were particularly pertinent to you. Did it work? Did it not? Well, we're in 2021 now, and we're seeing 20,000 page views in this course, which is housed in our LMS in each month. So in the first, we're just a few days into March here at the time that we grabbed the data, and we're on pace to be in the same ballpark. So people are really using the content now as kind of an on-demand resource, it seems. So where do we go from here? Well, more comprehensive updates to the Institute are forthcoming, including integrating literature, white papers, lessons learned from 2020, including specific pedagogical successes at JMU that people in the online learning unit have become aware of or have worked with faculty on. So general field level and then specific at our institution level. There's additional context and additional content on interaction, communication practices between faculty and instructional designers. So the participants and the facilitators of the Institute. Lots of new links, new content, video and media content, as you would expect. Faculty-led mentoring and consultation. So this is really that peer learning. So we're hoping that vicarious experience with peers helps to take the next step and to increase scale. So it's really challenging to build community in a large scale asynchronous institute. So the community and presence results didn't indicate that people felt overly connected to the people in the institute. And so it made us question, what does it look like to build community in a large scale asynchronous institute? And that question is one that the online learning team is actively thinking about and actively working about it and looking at other examples as well. So we look forward to seeing the data about community, even though the institute remains at scale, perhaps increasing because of their great work. So what do we learn about online learning strategy and lessons learned? Well, we learned that we have a whole bunch of questions, and there's a number of ways that the group could take the institute, could take the faculty development programming at large. But all of those decisions are going to depend on what happens post-pandemic for James Madison. Are we going to extensively expand our online learning footprint? Are we going to return to where we were in 2018 and 2019? All of these questions will really drive the next steps for the faculty development programming generally, and this institute specifically. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be with you live today, but please feel free to send questions to me or Qiong Christy.
Okay, great. Thank you to Erin. If you have any questions for Erin, please pop them into the Q&A box and we will pass them along. We're also sharing the authors' email addresses in chat if you'd like to get in touch with them directly. Okay, we're on to the next presentation. So now we'll turn it over to our next talk titled Associations Between Easy Proxy Use and Undergraduate Student GPA 2016 to 2019, presented by Felix Kabo, Assistant Research Scientist at the University of Michigan, Doreen Bradley, the Director of Learning Programs and Initiatives at the University of Michigan, and Stephanie Teasley, who is a research professor at the University of Michigan School of Information. So we're excited to hear from you. Why don't you get started?
Great. Hi again, my name is Felix Kabo from the University of Michigan, and I'm co-presenting with my colleagues Doreen Bradley and Stephanie Teasley. So the work we'd like to share with you today is a study that examines the link between library usage and student outcomes. And we did this work under the auspices or under the umbrella of the Library Learning Analytics Project. That's a project that's funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And one of the primary objectives for this project was to understand how can we better integrate library data in the learning analytics ecosystem at the university such that we can then use it to examine how library usage impacts learning in several areas. And for this study, we focus on course instruction. So when we talk about library usage, it's everything that's represented by this green cloud, meaning when you access library resources, when you're not on the university network. And so it's everything from the green cloud and the green arrows going to the resources, What does that mean? It means that if you are on the university network, you don't generate a proxy, you don't generate an easy proxy session because you are not required to authenticate. And so, and also if you just went the blue cloud, if you just went to, did a Google search, again, you're not going to have an easy proxy section. So just think of it as non-UVM network equals easy proxy session. And then this is a very stylized view of the data flow. So on the top left-hand side, the library created a secure data repository. And then we had to establish pipelines from the library to the Institute for Social Research. And that is where we set up the secure server. Now the library logs, when they come over from the repository, they're unstructured. So we have to structure them, clean them, and only then can we merge them with library data, with university data on student outcomes. And then after that, we can do the analysis. Some quick background, our theoretical framework is informed by models of information behavior. And one of the things I'd like to note is anything that's in the dashed box, it means that we do not have a way of directly measuring it in our analysis or in our models, but from the literature and from the research that's been done before, we know that it's a factor in this process of information seeking and outcomes. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the three bodies of research that we looked at is information behavior, but we also looked at work on the link between campus residency and student performance. And some of the studies that have found interesting differences, such as by race. So it's not just a question of whether someone is on or off campus, but sometimes demographic category matters. And then there's been work that's found differences in student performance between on-campus and off-campus or commuter students. And then the other body of work that we looked at was work on the digital divide. And here, most of the research focuses on disparities along demographic and geographic lines. So some of the more compelling findings show that underrepresented minorities tend to be at a significant disadvantage. But so are, if you look in terms of geography, rural areas tend to be more disadvantaged than urban areas. And what's interesting is that these disparities manifest themselves throughout the entire K through 16 pipeline. And with respect to what's happening now, the issue of campus residency and the digital divide, they've become even more salient since the pandemic. In fact, one could argue that there's interaction of these two. Our study population is our undergrads who are enrolled at the University of Michigan in the study period. Our dependent variables or outcomes are semester and cumulative GPA, and our independent variable predictor is having at least one easy proxy session in an academic term. And then if you recall, in the framework, there was that category of what they call intermediate variables, and those included things like social demographics, which are variables like race and gender. They also included academic background, and that would be things like class level or status, academic unit, which is like the school or college that a student is affiliated with. So we control for those in our models. And and one of the things that I'd like to note is we also do use one of those variables, the residency, to group analysis. So we don't just look at all students, but we also look at on versus off-campus students. So here are some descriptive statistics, and this is looking at the percentage of students that we were to identify as having at least one easy proxy session in academic term. And we've done this by semester, academic term. And you can see it ranges from 49% to 58%. What's interesting is if you then zero in by some of these demographic or academic background factors, you start seeing some interesting patterns emerge. And so we're just going to look at the one semester for that type of analysis, which is winter 2019. And a quick glance tells you that, well, there are some areas where you can start to see some interesting patterns. We'll just zero in on a few of this, where, for instance, for class level, we see that as a student progresses from lower classmen to upperclassmen status. We start seeing more evidence of them having at least one easy proxy session in an academic term. Now, U of M is a large research-run university, but unlike many other institutions, freshmen are not required or they're not compelled to live on campus. So, but we do also know that students are more likely to live off campus as they progress from lower to upperclassmen. But because we don't compel our freshmen to stay on campus, we think that there's something else happening here, which could reflect, it may be a reflection of the fact that juniors and seniors are more likely to have courses that require them to access library resources versus the proxy server. Now, here's another interesting thing we saw. It's the gender thing where you see way more females are more likely to have at least one easy proxy session in a term. And quite honestly, I can't explain this. And then the last one is residency. And we see that students who are off campus are more likely to have at least one easy proxy session in an academic term. And this is probably unsurprising because it's just saying that they're more likely to access the university library resources when they're not on the university network, which makes sense. And then before I describe our regression results, recall that our framework, our theoretical framework suggests that student outcomes are a function of factors such as race and gender, which apply to all students. And you can think of this as fixed effects. But then we also have factors such as the academic unit or the school or college, and these tend to cluster student behaviors and outcomes. And then also at the student level, there are things that are hard to account for, such as, and these are things that are unobserved, they're time invariant, things such as, motivation or perseverance or grit. So to account for those student level and academic unit factors, which you can think of as random effects, we ran panel linear mixed effects regression models. And I'm just going to share with you the results for our predictor independent variable, which is having at least one easy proxy session in an academic term. We see that for all students, having at least one easy proxy session in a term is associated with an increase in GPA of 0.14. So those are not huge effects. However, I think that for a student at the margin, if you're on the cusp of getting an A- versus a B+, that might make a difference. What's interesting is when you then look at the two groups of students on campus versus off campus separately, what we see is the effect size for students who are off campus is larger than the effect size for students who are on campus. When you look at cumulative GPA, the effect size is even smaller. What's interesting here, though, is there's a flip. So where before for semester GPA, the effect size was larger for off-campus students, here the effect size is larger for on-campus students. So to recap, the descriptive stats show that social demographics and academic background factors are associated with having at least one easy proxy session in a term. Females, upperclassmen, and off-campus students are significantly more likely to have at least one easy proxy session per term compared to males, lower-classmen, and on-campus students. Then moving on to the regression results, we see that having at least one easy proxy session is associated with a semester GPA that's 0.14 higher. But then again, we see that there are differences between on and off-campus students, where the effect size or the benefits seem to be larger for off-campus students. And then, but then when you look at cumulative GPA, the effect size is larger for on-campus students. So there's some limitations to this work. So despite our best efforts, a student could be off campus and she or he may not actually show up on our easy proxy logs because they decided to tunnel to the library resources via a VPN. So that's something that's really hard to account for. And then even with having run the panel linear mixed effects models to account for random effects, there's still very likely other factors that we didn't account for that impact not just student access to library resources via the proxy server, but also student success itself. And then the other path-based dependencies, if you think of the academic progression that we cannot account for in our models. So for instance, at Michigan, we have something called the Undergraduate Research Opportunities Program. And one could reasonably assume that students who participate in such a program might have different patterns of accessing library resources than those who do not. But to round up here, what we think our work shows is that merging library data to other institutional data can yield really valuable insights, and in this case, on understanding the link from library use to student outcomes. And this has significant implications for library policy and practice. So, for example, we know that at Michigan, about 80% of all undergraduate nursing students live off campus. But we also know that nursing is a very library resource intensive program. And so you can imagine that for this group of students, the digital divide or digital disparities could have really detrimental effects for the students who are disadvantaged. And so one could ask, what can the library do to mitigate these potential disparities from students who are living off campus and are suffering from this digital divide? The other thing that this study does, or this work does, is to suggest some possible future directions. So one of the things that we can look at down the road is what are the impacts of course selection, both on the need to use library resources, but also on the motivation to use library resources. We'd like to acknowledge other members of the lab team. Some actually might be on this panel, but there are a number who are not part of the presentation group that are also co-authors, and that includes Nick, Ken, and Michael. And would like to say that if you have any questions for us, here are our emails. We'll be posting our slide deck on the project website. And with that, I'd like to open the floor for questions.
Thank you all. That's fantastic. So that was really an exciting and interesting presentation, and I hope that Ken can also join you, because I know he's here for Q&A. So we have a couple questions coming in. The first one is, what kind of actions can a library take based on your results?
So I will actually let Doreen take the lead on answering that question.
Sure. We think if we think about the nursing example that we just took a look at, we know that 80% of our nursing students do not live on campus, and that probably includes some first-year students as well. And we know that the library is integrated really into every single year of the undergraduate nursing curriculum in particular, and the graduate level, that we can really be proactive in working with faculty to find out what are the expectations for these courses and what these students are doing, and are there things that we can help to do at the front end to make some library research easier for students who potentially live off campus, or if students have reached out to faculty saying that they have difficulties, or even if they're working through an advisor who is trying to help them to get to where they need to be academically, there may be things that the library can do on both ends in helping share information that, some of these nursing students we don't see any activity with them if advisors or faculty reach out to us, but also really being proactive on the front end and finding out what can we do to help these students. Because we know there are lots of nursing students, for an example, who they do your first 2 years at a community college, get an RN degree, and then they go on to complete their bachelor's, but they're working. They may have families, they just have other things in their lives. They may be non-traditional students. So there's a lot that the library can do, I think, to help in situations like those, just as one example.
That's really helpful, Doreen. Thank you. And one last question before our next presenters. Beyond easy proxy data, what else is on the group's wish list for data to include to better understand the connections and linkages to student success?
I can take a stab at that. So we also are looking at search data, though that is turned out to be much more of a rapid semester. So we are trying to understand, just broadly speaking, patterns in search behaviors and what that might portend in terms of, if you may, projecting what kinds of materials are in demand at certain times of the year. But we do have access to that. And then the other thing we're also doing is trying to to simplify like network analysis to sort of understand, can we understand how these search patterns vary by academic unit, for example, so that we can better understand those, have a much more granular understanding of such behaviors.
Yeah, I would just add that we know that that students benefit from the library in lots of different ways. And the Easy Proxy data tells us when they're coming to the library from an off-campus site, but it doesn't help us capture what they're doing there, how they're using it. And then, of course, once students return to campus, there are lots of other ways that they can interact with the library. And having that data available and being able to match it up then with other things we know about the students, like whether they're in the nursing program, whether they're on the engineering campus, whether they're first generation college students, all those kinds of things can help us really figure out ways that students are benefiting from the library, who's missing out, and then thinking, as Doreen suggested, about ways that we can help intervene early with students in comfortable ways for them and for us to help them figure out what they need to be doing that will help them in their career, their educational career.
And I'd like to add briefly, but even as right now we're focusing on undergrads, but if you start looking at grad and professional students, then data like ILL and special collections might become being more salient for so the different kinds of data that we'll be looking at down the road depend on the group of students or even faculty that we're interested in.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, Doreen, Felix, Ken. This is a fantastic work, really exciting and new. Thank you so much. Our next presentation is titled Privacy Expectations, Student Perspectives on Learning Analytics in Libraries and Higher Education, and is presented by Michael Perry, Head of Assessment and Planning at Northwestern University, and Andrew Asher, Associate Professor and Assessment Librarian at Indiana University-Bloomington. Andrew and Michael, take it away.
Great, thank you so much, everyone, for having us. We're really excited to talk to everyone about this research project that we've been engaged in over the last few years. So you can flip the slide for me. Thank you. So the plan is I'm going to give a little bit of an overview to the overall research project, and then I'll hand it over to Andrew to talk about the results of the particular survey we'll be talking about today. Flip it. So first and foremost, I want to thank the entirety of our research team. So you can see all the lovely folks whose great work has made this research possible. Thank you to each and every one of them for their contributions. Go ahead. So what was the motivation for this research project? As we began looking at this a number of years ago, we realized there was very little research that addressed the learning analytics and how those processes related to student privacy issues and what the student perspective was into these projects. So those formed the guiding research questions, namely, how do learning analytics initiatives align with or run counter to student expectations of privacy? And how might libraries maximize the benefits of learning analytics while still respecting students' expectations around privacy, as well as our professional obligations? So we took those questions and formulated a grant proposal, which we were very thankful to IMLS for funding. It's entitled Getting to Know Their Data Doubles and Inquiry into Student Perceptions of Privacy Issues Associated with Academic Research Libraries. So thank you again to IMLS for funding this research. So the overall goals of this project in its entirety identify any learning analytics practice or technology design should be informed at some level by the student perspective. So our individual goals to identify reactions, both positive and negative, to learning analytics practices by undergraduate students, to understand privacy expectations and preferences, especially among specific demographic groups where data allows, and to understand differences among those groups in these perspectives. And then finally, to recommend information policy and technology design changes to institutional administrators so that we can hopefully build learning analytics processes that do respect student perspectives of privacy and what students believe should be happening in these instances. So there's been 3 phases to our research. The first phase, which is largely completed, the team looked at, conducted preliminary interviews with students to understand generally themes around library participation in learning analytics and views around privacy as they relate to learning analytics and libraries. That paper has been written up and you can find that in our resource pages. We're going to be talking about phase 2 today. This was the research team taking what they learned in those preliminary interviews and developing a survey that was fielded to graduate students at each of the researchers' prospective institutions. And then we are currently working on phase 3, which is a series of scenario-based focus groups that'll help students explore very real-world applications of learning analytics so that we can understand in a very real granular way how those processes might respect and or break their expectations of privacy. So that's a little bit of our project in a nutshell. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Andrew to talk about the results of the survey in particular.
Thanks, Mike. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the development of the survey and then get into some of the results. The Data Doubles Research Survey consists of 25 questions containing 154 unique responses. These responses are organized into 7 thematic modules, including knowledge about learning analytics, data sharing and use, access rights and limits, data access and limits, data rights, consent, privacy, and trust. During the survey development process, we spent a lot of time doing both content validation and reliability analysis. Content validation consisted of a subject matter expert panel review, which looked at the coherence of module constructs, as well as question comprehension and definition of key terms. And then we conducted in-depth cognitive interviews with undergraduate students that used a hybrid think aloud verbal probing method. We really wanted to spend time on the survey validating the construction of the questions since it was a new survey. Post-survey reliability of the modules was assessed using the omega statistic. And all of these modules achieved moderate to high levels of reliability. That is, the value of this omega statistic was greater than 0.80. This presentation will focus on responses to the survey questions related to students' perceptions about librarian and academic library participation in learning analytics initiatives, especially through data collection, use, and sharing. A stratified random sample was requested from each university of 4,000 to 5,000 students. From this, we sent just under 36,000 recruitment emails to potential participants, followed by 3 reminders to students who hadn't completed the survey. And the full response rate results are up on the screen. This overall survey response rate was 6%, including both partial and complete responses. A little over 1,900 students completed the entire survey, while another 338 completed a minimum of 19 questions, which is the equivalent of 1 survey module. This gives a total of 2,246 participants and a relative standard error of 2.28% at 95% confidence. The 6% response rate is a bit low, lower than desirable. It's not atypical of this type of student survey, especially during the COVID era, which has dropped response rates kind of across all surveys. However, the absolute value of the response rate is less important to the generalizability of the survey than how well the respondents represent the population being studied. This can be evaluated by comparing the demographic data collected in the survey to known characteristics of the university's student bodies. When we did this, and the results of this are up on the screen, we found that the survey data generally reflected the expected proportions. However, Asian American students and female students are slightly overrepresented, and Hispanic, Latinx, and Spanish origin and male students are slightly underrepresented. A second potential source of sampling bias derives from variance in response rates of participating university students relative to their enrollments. To evaluate this, we conducted an analysis comparing student responses between the participating institutions and found no statistically meaningful differences based on an institutional affiliation. We therefore treat the students as a single group for the purposes of this presentation. So now moving on to the results from the survey, and unfortunately we only have time to give a snapshot of results here. The full results will be posted on our website, including question by question analysis. So students almost universally considered privacy to be important. They particularly found it important to protect against intrusions in their life, 94% answering yes, to develop their identity, and to a lesser degree to develop intellectual ideas and personal relationships. Students generally assumed libraries collect and utilize personally identifiable information. A majority of students believe that libraries utilize PII about them to identify the materials they use and the services they use. Many students also believe that the library uses their PII to identify the websites they use and to recommend books, journals, and other resources. It should be noted that many students were unsure about whether their PII was being used by libraries across all of these questions, with about a third of students answering that they were just unsure. In addition to using PII, many students thought that libraries can give data to third parties, both inside and outside the university. 47% of students said the library can share a PII with other offices affiliated with my university, 44% with law enforcement, 40% with academic advisors, and 30% with course instructors. However, only 14% thought their PII could be shared with outside businesses and advertisers. Again, across all of these questions, about a third of students answered they were unsure. Sharing information with outside entities was something of a red line for students, which obviously has important implications for libraries' agreements with our vendors. Students were asked to identify how private they considered their use of various types of information, including their use of physical and online library resources. Only 22% of students considered their use of physical library resources to be completely private, while another 52% felt that these activities were sometimes public and sometimes private. And these results are down at the bottom of this chart. Use of online resources had similar distribution, with completely public at 24% and sometimes public and sometimes private at 50%. Opinions about the use of learning management systems exhibited a similar pattern, suggesting that students may understand the university systems to be equivalent in practice and policy. However, only 11% of students considered internet browsing history to be completely public, while 50% perceived it to be completely private. In comparison, 93% of students consider their banking information to be completely private. Students generally viewed financial information and health records to be the most private of information types. Survey participants were asked to respond to 5 questions about university employees' use of personally identifiable and de-identifiable student data. When asked if librarians had access to my personal identifying information, I would feel my privacy was violated. 70% of students responded yes, they would feel that it was a privacy violation. Conversely, they were much less concerned about de-identified information. Again, students overwhelmingly thought sharing PII outside the university represented a privacy violation at 92%. More students felt their privacy would be violated by librarians accessing or sharing their PII than any other type of university employee at 70%. And a majority of students felt their privacy would be violated by sharing PII inside and outside the university by any type of employee. And this graph isn't shown. Nevertheless, students in general reported that they were comfortable with their institutions collecting information about them. 81% of students indicated they were either comfortable or very comfortable with the collection of physical and online library usage data. This was in contrast to the response about internet browsing data, which showed nearly the opposite pattern. Finally, when students were asked whether they trusted the university library and librarians to use their PII in a way that respected their trust, students reported that mostly they trust the library. 72% said trust completely or somewhat, and librarians at 70% combined. However, for both questions, 16% responded that they don't trust the library or librarians at all. Comparatively, students reported trusting the university more than the library at 81%, and social media companies much less at only 21%.
Thanks, Andrew. So I want to close it up by highlighting some of our big takeaways from this research to this point. And I think first and foremost, whenever we're embarking on a learning analytics project, please be sure to consider the student perspectives and look for ways to make the process more transparent to student or involve them in some way in those processes so that they understand how their data is what data is being collected, how that data is going to be used, and most importantly, areas in which that data might be shared. As we've seen. Students did view the library access to personally identifiable information and sharing data around the campus to be privacy violations. We have something of a contrast with that other information or the other bit of data where it seemed like they were okay with the libraries collecting data about them. And I think that goes to some of the literacy components around these big data projects where students are not often clear about what constitutes personally identifiable information and what constitutes de-identified information, which they were more comfortable sharing with people. We found that a lot in the phase 1 interviews as well, where students often didn't understand the exact differentiations between those things. Kind of to reiterate the first point, students need clearer access to details about data collection and sharing practices, as well as the goals for learning analytics projects. This is a thing that often students come back to, is wanting to know what is the clear outcome people are looking for when they're embarking on these data collections and analytics practices. Finally, as we saw in that last slide, libraries have a great deal of trust from our users. We've known this from many different ways. We want to make sure that learning analytics projects build on the trust that users have in our institutions and aren't actively doing anything to erode that trust. So again, that speaks to making sure that things are transparent and looking for opportunities in which you can involve students and make the process clearer to them. And then finally, as we talked about a little bit, students of differing groups seem to have different privacy views, and especially understand that students from groups other than their own may feel very different about privacy issues. This was a very interesting thing and something that we're looking to explore further as we hope to field the survey a little bit more and build out the data, because we really want to understand what those demographic differences mean for those student groups. But it is really heartening to see the overwhelming response from students that they feel very understanding that while they might be okay with a particular thing as it relates to privacy, they do understand that they have peers who may feel very differently about those things. So those are our big takeaways. Again, I do want to thank IMLS for all of the great work that they do, and in particular, giving us the ability to do this work with everybody. So thank you again, IMLS. And then finally, if you'd like more information, up here you have our website with a list of various publications where you can find things about the earlier phases of the project, as well as our research repository and our email if you should have any questions beyond those today. So with that, I think we'll open it up if anyone has any questions.
Thanks, Andrew and Asher and Michael Perry. That was fantastic presentation. I do have 2 questions that have come in for you. So one of the ones I think is going to give you an opportunity to talk about that last takeaway a little bit more, which is good because I didn't know if you were trying to get to your time limit, and I want you to be able to talk about it. So the question notes that you got the expected proportion from your survey results with relationship to race and other factors in the student populations, but that the response was pretty overwhelmingly white. And the question is about your thoughts or your plans about figuring out how to investigate further the unique needs of BIPOC students and how they might view privacy differently or have unique concerns. So can you talk about that a little bit? And then we've got one more question too so far.
So I can speak to that. So part of the demographic breakdown is a function of the institutions that were involved, which unfortunately are mostly majority white, not totally across the board, but the majority of those institutions do tend to have white majority populations. We did see some very interesting results breaking down the demographics, looking at minority populations, especially people of color being more concerned about various uses of their data and PII, which is not surprising. Those were significant. They had relatively small effect sizes at this stage. We do have plans for hopefully a future follow-up study that looks particularly at minority populations, both racial and ethnic minority and gender minority populations, to hopefully tease out some of those differences in a more robust way. But unfortunately, we were limited a little bit by the populations that responded to our survey at this stage.
Great. Next project then, right? You always need to know where you're going next.
Yeah.
And another follow-up that's related a little bit is about, in terms of looking at different types of students, is do you know if there's a difference in response between foreign students and other students? So international students and domestic students?
Yes, we do. The international students followed very closely to the breakdown of the demographics of the university. So we had a pretty robust sample of international students.
Okay, and then I'm going to sneak in one more question because we're going into break next. Is was there anything that surprised you in your findings?
I see Mike thinking. This is a little bit of a hard one because Mike and I and the other members of our research team have been really involved in privacy research for a number of years. So it's a little bit hard for us to be suddenly surprised by a lot of our findings. One thing that we're really kind of teasing out a lot in this data is there does seem to be a little bit of a paradox between students believing libraries are collecting and utilizing their data and being okay with the institution doing that for ways that may benefit them, but then at the same time talking about how they believe it's a privacy violation. And so one of the things we're really interested in kind of doing detailed analysis on is where is that point where it becomes something that students are okay with as part of their education, and where is the line that we cross that it really feels like something that is uncomfortable or more like what they experience on Facebook or in other contexts, which we definitely saw in terms of social media companies that the students were much more nervous about how their data is being used. So there's definitely some gray area there that deserves some more detailed digging into. And between the results from the interviews that we have and the survey data, which we're going to start combining, I think we can really get some interesting and detailed analysis that will be helpful to people.
Yeah, it's very super thought-provoking and interesting, and I hope that the scenarios are equally as exciting as what you've presented so far. So thank you very much, Andrew and Michael. So now we'll be taking our first 15-minute break. We'll be playing some background music as your auditory cue, and the next presentation will start at 40 minutes past the hour. Thanks. And we're back. It's good to see all of you. Okay, great. So as we reconvene and give everybody a second, like, oh, there's talking. No more nice music. Our next presentation is titled Open Access Publishing, a study of UC Berkeley faculty views and practices with implications for library support. Presented by Chan Lee, the assessment librarian at the University of California, Berkeley, Becky Miller, the natural resources librarian at the University of California, Berkeley, and Mohamed Hamid, who is the Middle Eastern and Near Eastern Studies librarian at the University of California, Berkeley. Take it away.
Thank you, Megan. Welcome to our presentation today. Our colleagues, we're going to discuss a research project that we conducted as part of the ARL Research Library Impact Pilots. Our research is to explore the connections between Berkeley faculty views and practice around open access publishing. Sorry, I actually forgot to share my slide, so I would start it right now. So we're going to talk about the background, the faculty survey, the methods, analysis, and findings, and then we'll follow up with the discussion implications and also the future research. I will hand this over to Mohamed.
Thank you, Shan. For the background, in 2018, the University of California system announced a major UC initiative to transform the scholarly publishing industry with numerous communications regarding open access. Around the same time, in 2018, the library conducted the Ithaca faculty survey, where we realized that 71% of our faculty versus 63% nationwide indicated that they would be happy to see the traditional publication model replaced by open access publication system. Our group actually were kind of motivated to investigate the open access productivity of UC Berkeley faculty and compare that with their views on scholarly publication, which were expressed in the faculty survey. Next, please. Next. One of the questions in the library survey, actually there was a one before that. Yes, yeah. The faculty survey itself was sent to 2,748 Berkeley faculty members, where 811 faculty responded with 30% response rate. The high majority of respondents came from the lecturers among the faculty members. The questions were 41 questions in the survey itself. As you can see in this chart here, there is this kind of distribution among the subject groupings with a high percent rate for responses from arts and humanities, followed by social sciences, with very good response rate also from health science and life sciences as well. Next. One of the questions in the survey itself was question 10, where the survey was asking the faculty about the factors that influence the faculty's decision about journals in which they publish their articles. 676 respondents were analyzed for this question. The top three factors were when 91% indicated that the journal is widely distributed, and high impact factor were the top two. And then the third one was the journal itself is related to the faculty immediate research area with 84%. Please. In the same question, question 10, there were also a number of other factors, and there were two of them related to open access. And actually, these were no cost to read and no cost to publish. For no cost to publish, it was important to 59% of the faculty respondents, and for no cost to read was important to 41%. Similar to other studies, open access were ranked lower among influencing factors. Next, please. as you can tell from the differences between the subject groupings, there was a difference between those areas, especially for no cost to publish versus no cost to read. And for arts and humanities, for example, it was higher for no cost to publish, where it was higher for no cost to read for life and health sciences. This may be related to the funding availability for faculty, as it was also realized from another question number 18, in the survey itself, where it was asked about, the survey asked the faculty about if they received any external funding in the previous 5 years of the survey itself. So life and health sciences received, faculty received 86% of the health and life sciences faculty received funding, where 22 only of the arts and humanities received funding. With that background, I will leave it to Chan to speak about the methods of the project.
Thank you, Mohamed. So our study includes two major components. The first part is to collect and analyze the survey responses from the faculty survey that Mohamed talked about. We primarily focus on the one question that is related to two open access publishing motivation factors, which are the importance of no cost to read and no cost to publish. So during the second part of the project, we extracted and analyzed the survey respondents' publication data, including both overall publication output and a gold OA output. The publication data for the respondents, such as total number of articles, the funding information, others, they were retrieved from Scopus by using multiple APIs. The OA status information, such as whether they're closed, green, gold, hybrid, or bronze, those data came from Unpaywall. Unpaywall database defines different categories of OA, which I have the definition on the slides. The gold OA are the ones published in fully OA journals. And that's our analysis focus, because this category reflects the strongest intention to publish OA. And authors often publishing in gold OA journals know that their articles will be immediately available OA. And in most cases, they also have to pay the article publishing charges. So after joining the survey responses and their publication data, our sample includes 479 Berkeley faculty who published more than 4,400 articles from 2016 to 2019. And among those publications, 18% of them are gold OA. So the analysis method that we use is the correlation analysis, which connects the survey responses and publication data. The connection is also examined by a variety of demographic parameters, such as faculty's discipline, years of experience in their field, and funding availability. In the next couple of slides, I will just going to talk about how the different groups are represented in our data sample. So this is the subject grouping. Overall in our data set, 79% of the total publications are published by life and health sciences and engineering and physical sciences authors. Social science, even though 32% of authors identified are from social science disciplines, their publication output only represent 18%. And arts and humanities are even more disproportionately represented in the data set, as only 4% of articles published by 20% of the faculty. And looking at the faculty's years of experiences, faculty with at least 21 years of experiences represent the majority of the data set. 55% of articles are published by the most senior faculty, and then followed by other groups. And overall, 71% of articles are published by Berkeley faculty were coded with funding information in Scopus, while 28% of the articles did not indicate a funding source. However, the funding information, it does not necessarily mean that authors have received funding, but Berkeley authors have received funding because the funding is, that information is tied to the articles, not tied to the individual authors. Here's a picture about OA landscape at Berkeley. Among all the published articles, only 28 are closed, which means 72% of articles published by Berkeley authors are open access. Green OA is the largest shares, has the largest shares of OA output, which is 29%. Gold OA output is second larger contributor, which is 18%. And also the right chart shows that gold OA has been steadily increasing over the years. It has increased 20% more compared to 2016. It's a positive indicator that Berkeley authors have intentionally published more gold OA articles. The OA output varies by subject, ranging from 40% to 79%. LHS and EPS have the highest shares of OA articles of O type, while arts and humanity have the lowest. And then the right pie chart shows the gold OA distribution. So the majority of the gold OA articles published are published by authors in in life and health sciences field. 63% of them are authored by LHS faculty, 26 by EPS, and 11 by social science faculty. There are only 2 gold OA articles published by arts and humanity authors in 2019. So that clearly the science disciplines not only publish the most OA, but they also produce the highest shares of gold OA at Berkeley, and especially for the LHS disciplines. Now I will hand this over to Becky.
Thank you, Chan. So now that Mohamed has described the results of the faculty survey and Chan has described the OA publication output that we found in Scopus, I'm going to show some analyses where we put these together. So first, let's look at this chart, which is a correlation chart that shows 1 dot for every author. It compares the percent of the author's articles that are gold OA with how they ranked the importance of a journal being free to read. As you can see, most of the faculty feel a journal being free to read is important, and those who publish more gold OA feel more strongly about this. Next, please. Here's another correlation chart. This one focuses on the importance of authors being able to publish articles for free. So you can see that most faculty feel no-cost publishing is important when selecting a journal. But in this case, there's not a strong relationship between the importance ratings and gold OA publishing, but there is a slight trend that authors who publish less gold OA feel more strongly about not having APCs, article processing charges. Next, please. So now let's look at disciplinary differences in gold OA publishing and attitude towards OA. So these charts show average importance ratings in gold OA publishing by our 4 subject groups. So life and health sciences has the most gold OA publishing, while arts and humanities has the least. LHS authors on average feel more strongly that journals should be free to read and are the least concerned about journals having no-cost publishing. However, even though their average rating on no-cost publishing is lower than the other 3 groups, it's still more than 6 out of 10. Arts and humanities, by contrast, feels most strongly that journals should not charge publishing fees. Social sciences feels least strongly that journals should be free to read. So what contributes to disciplinary differences? Well, we know from other studies that LHS has an established OA publishing system with funder mandates, quality gold OA journals and repositories, and what's described as a pro-open culture. In contrast, some disciplines within engineering and physical sciences are more focused on green OA, and social sciences and arts and humanities don't have the same OA culture, and there aren't as many reputable OA journals in these fields. Researchers in these disciplines may associate APCs with predatory journals and have less research funding. Next slide. So now let's look at how funding plays a role. This is based on the funding information from Scopus. You can see that the differences are pretty small and they're what you'd expect. Researchers lacking funding are more concerned about publishing costs, and researchers who have funding publish more gold OA and think it's more important that journals are free to read. But in general, whether or not there's funding doesn't appear to influence views too much. And of course, having research funding doesn't necessarily translate into money for APCs. Next. So our study has some limitations. First, we can't be sure what role Berkeley authors played in journal selection and whether their funds went to APCs. Our sample was heavily biased toward the sciences since we used Scopus, which is about 3/4 science content. We focused on gold, but ideally we'd look at hybrid articles too, where authors have to pay APCs, but we couldn't separate those out from the other hybrid articles using unpaywall. And there are other pro-OA behaviors that we didn't capture related to academic social networks or immediate depositing of green OA articles. Next, but given those limitations, we think our study was still valuable. It was small compared to some of these other studies, but it was unique in the way we were able to link attitudes and practices for individuals. And despite the smaller scale, our results generally concurred with other studies. Next, please. So many studies show that support for OA and OA publishing are both growing. Our results suggest Berkeley is above average in both, with gold OA publishing increasing. 3 recent large studies that also used unpaywall data found total levels of OA at less than 50%, but our study found 72%. And UC's open access policy likely contributes to high open access, plus the high level of research funding and funder mandates, especially in the STEM disciplines. Next, please. But OA is still not a top priority for authors. However, we did find that Berkeley authors who publish more gold OA feel more positive about OA, so experience publishing OA helps. But like others have found, APCs may still be a barrier. They were a concern for authors whether or not their research was funded. This is a place where libraries can help, both with dedicated APC funds and transformative funding agreements. Next, please. So how could we take this research further? We want to find a way to assess OA scholarly output for arts and humanities and social sciences faculty that weren't represented well in Scopus. We could also look at disciplinary differences within the STEM subject groups, since those differences are important too. Also, we found that authors of funded articles still request library APC funds, so it would be interesting to explore authors' practices around using their research funds for APCs. And finally, UC has recent transformative publishing agreements with 9 publishers, including a brand new agreement with Elsevier. So going forward, we'll monitor what impact this has on OA levels at Berkeley. So thank you very much. We're ready for questions.
Yes, thank you, Chan, Becky, and Mohamed. So audience, please enter your questions in the Q&A box and I'll read the question for the speaker and audience. We do have one question ready to go, so let's get to that one. Based on your research, how would you frame conversations about OA differently with different disciplinary faculty groups on your campus?
That's a good question. It does seem that I mean, I know I work with a lot of the departments in the LHS group, and, definitely you can see that there's sort of already a culture of OA publishing there. I get asked about OA publishing by people in those departments, and the people in some of those departments apply for the APC funds quite a bit. So I think that a lot of it is kind of, peers encouraging each other and everything. But I do also feel like some of it is just the availability of good OA journals or journals with a hybrid option. It's just not the same across all the disciplines. But I don't know, maybe Mohamed, since he works more with the arts and humanities side, maybe he can speak to that culture there.
Thank you, Becky. It's actually, for arts and humanities, it is known as a monograph field. It's not probably that much for journal articles. And this is kind of a very much big understanding in arts and humanities in general, where the focus is monographs and books and all of that. And this may request or require something similar to APC or cost for publishing, but not exactly the same as journal articles. For journal articles, it's still not very much seen there. And as Becky said, there is no big funding for that, and there is no big trend to go this way. And there is no that much of also big names or reputable journals that actually can take the journal articles, and probably for those who are less than 21 years in the field can get to promote or to get to tenure track and all of that. So for arts and humanities, probably to some level, social sciences, it's not the same as it is in STEM fields or science fields. That's kind of pretty much the same as other institutions as well. So in Berkeley, it's kind of the same as others.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohamed, Chan, and Becky. That was a great presentation. We appreciate it. Next up, we have developing best practices and ethical guidelines for assessing reuse of digital content, presented by Joyce Chapman, assessment analyst and consultant at Duke University Libraries, and Carolyn Muglia, who is the co-associate dean of collections at the University of Southern California. Over to you, Joyce and Carolyn.
Thank you. So I'll share my screen and get in presenter mode. Oh, the dance. All right, thank you, everyone. Excuse me. I'm going to turn off my my video for technology reasons. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our presentation on developing best practices and ethical guidelines for assessing reuse of digital content. My name is Caroline Muglia from the University of Southern California, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Joyce Chapman at Duke University. So we'll provide an overview of our grant, including our goals and specifically 2 deliverables of the project. First, the ethical guidelines, and second, the best practices. We'll share some next steps, and then we'll leave time, of course, for some questions. All right. Let's jump right in. So the work we are doing is part of an IMLS National Leadership Grant called DCRAFT, Digital Content Reuse Assessment Framework Toolkit. It's a multi-year IMLS grant that began in the summer of 2019 and builds on a previous IMLS grant developing a framework for measuring reuse of digital objects, which was from 2017 to 2019. And then before that, DLF's Assessment Interest Group in 2015. That's really the group's origin story. DCRAFT has several deliverables, including developing guidelines and best practices for practitioners in galleries, libraries, archives, museums, repositories, and data. So we call them GLAMORed organizations to assess how users engage with, reuse, and transform digital content. So let me take a quick step back to ground us in the language before we move into some of the examples of our deliverables. While digital library practitioners measure use of digital collections using access metrics and other metrics that I'm sure y'all are familiar with, they rarely measure or assess reuse in research, social media, instruction, and other formats. Reuse metrics are often anecdotal and ephemeral, which pose a challenge, actually many challenges, to collection and comparison to other metrics. So DCRAFT is really living in this space of reuse to develop tools that can help practitioners produce and leverage meaningful assessment from reuse activity. This is a project team, 7 project team members and 3 current consultants. Joyce focuses on assessment. You'll see that we'll soon also be hiring an accessibility consultant and an instruction design consultant for future deliverables. And then here's our incredible advisory board. They're not just for show. We ask a lot of them and their expertise, and they've been instrumental in shaping the work that you'll see here today. All right, so as I mentioned, one of the first deliverables is developing ethical guidelines and considerations for practitioners in GLAMORed organizations to assess how users engage with, reuse, and transform content. The goal of the guidelines is to put forth a set of principles to guide ethical assessment of reuse. So that's what this deliverable is about. We identified the need for a document like this one in our original grant, Measuring Reuse. To accomplish the task of drafting these guidelines, we reviewed professional GLAMORed codes, practices, policies, guidelines. We consulted privacy and ethics working groups focused on GLAMORed institutions, and we leveraged privacy and DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility consultants within our group, and then also within our grant budget, of course, to make sure that when we did draft the guidelines, those areas would be privileged. The goal of the document is really utility. We offer recommendations and descriptions, but we also try hard to offer practical applications and examples of the topics that we raise in our guidelines. So I mentioned that we surveyed and assessed current codes, policies, guidelines, practices of GLAMORed institutions to learn what those institutions chose to explore in their documents, and then also how it served or communicated to their communities. Of course, you know that our assessment consultant will not let us get away with just throwing something together. Thank you, Joyce. So here's an overview of the process that we engaged to survey these broad documents. So first, we developed a gauge or a criteria, a list of questions we asked of each document. We collected the documents in Zotero, a citation management system for those who are unfamiliar, and then we split into 2 groups. Each group read their assigned documents against or in conversation with that gauge that we developed to ensure that we all asked and answered the same questions for all the documents. Every document we surveyed had multiple readers, again, to ensure that we had all of our angles covered and that we could discuss issues and opportunities and even biases that arose from that engagement. And then finally, we used Voyant, and you can see a screenshot here, to conduct word and phrase frequency analysis. Again, our goal was really to understand what these documents included so that we could draft our own guidelines with this information in mind. So here's a peek at what we reviewed. We identified and reviewed 44 codes. We reviewed over 4,000 terms and 30 phrases. And then once we did all of this, we began to develop our own documentation, which became the basis of our ethical guidelines. So our guidelines rest on 6 core values. We distilled these values from the new knowledge that we gleaned from reviewing these community codes of practice, as well as cases from our 2017 IMLS grant, these sort of use cases that we developed. We felt strongly that these are the areas that are important to the Glamored community. And as we quickly learned, they're really hard to write about with some measure of authority. There's a lot nested in each of these core values that represents different opinions and perspectives depending on the community. What we developed was a 14-page document formally called Ethical Considerations and Guidelines for the Assessment of Use and Reuse of Digital Content. And then of course, the bulk of these documents really focused on those 6 core values that you saw on the previous slide. The advisory board reviewed, well, first I should say that the project team reviewed and revised the first draft. And then once we incorporated those revisions, we then opened it up to our advisory board, that team of 7 people who reviewed this in 2020, and then we implemented those comments. Again, we aimed for utility, so we tried really hard to incorporate all of those revisions, and then where there was a tension or a conversation, we really tried to have that conversation fully. And then from there, we offered an open commenting period for community practitioners, including groups led by or inclusive of underrepresented communities, as well as bigger general groups like ALA, SAA, ACRL, and others. And in our open commenting period, we received feedback from 37 individual commenters and then 8 responses via our Qualtrics survey instrument that we offered as an alternative to the Google commenting. I won't go through these in super detail, but I wanted to offer just a few comments that we received from our commenters. One commenter highlighted that we needed to consider people with functional impairments or disabilities more than we already did. Another suggested that we should dedicate a section to include cultural and community privacy rather than privacy of personally identifiable information or as it relates to kind of technology platforms. And then yet another suggested that we have so many words and so many phrases in our document that we really need to define them. Again, we wanted these guidelines to apply to a broad community base, so this was an important one for us. We didn't want inaccessible language or phrasing or acronyms included in our document without them being defined and contextualized. So what we're going to be doing next and looking ahead in this deliverable, we asked for and received a lot of feedback. Perhaps some of you on this call offered that feedback. Thank you. This isn't the only, it's not only grammar feedback, but really important in some cases, unanswerable questions of this document. We developed a summary of the feedback, which we'll publish alongside the guidelines, and we're identifying experts in certain areas where the most substantive insight is needed to really do these topics justice. Okay, I'm going to pass this presentation along to my colleague Joyce, who's going to discuss best practices, which is our next deliverable.
Okay, so a big part of our toolkit is the best practices for assessing reuse. And while they're not currently in their final form, these will eventually be a suite of web pages that are going to walk practitioners through the ins and outs of methods to assess digital content use and reuse. The drafts of these assessment methods and tools for collecting reuse data are close to being open to the public for feedback, but we can't point you to them just yet. Slide. The team began with a thorough literature review, including materials published in 2010 and onward, as technology changes very quickly and most tools for data collection change too. We collected hundreds of articles and case studies, and we used Deduce, which is a platform for collaboratively analyzing qualitative and mixed method research, to review and code topical content and extract, organize, and tag excerpts. Slide. After analyzing the data from Deduce and synthesizing what we've learned, we came up with 10 methods for collecting data about the reuse of digital content. One of the challenges of this grant is that while it's focused on assessing reuse of digital content, it's much easier to collect data on use than reuse. And the line is also somewhat squishy between what even constitutes use and reuse in some areas. We made the decision to include some major tools like web analytics that mostly provide data helpful to use assessment, but do have some ability to help paint a picture of reuse. Our assumption is that practitioners arriving at this toolkit online are probably interested in both use and reuse assessment, and many may be unfamiliar with methods for either. So we want the toolkit to provide helpful information for those folks, as well as those more focused on only reuse assessment. Slide. The toolkit will provide pretty detailed information on each method. We aim to make these methods accessible to practitioners who are totally unfamiliar, but also hope that advanced practitioners will find useful information here. While some of these methods have really extensive online documentation already, our documentation attempts to explain the method in an easy to understand way from the perspective of assessment in glamored institutions. Each method has the following information: a simple definition, more extensive and detailed explanation of how it is used specifically for use and reuse assessment of digital content, a list of the common tools that can be used to collect the data you would need for this method of assessment, and all of these link out to tool-specific pages in the toolkit that we've created. A section on responsible practice that connects the ethical guidelines to this assessment method, strengths and weaknesses, and where possible, highlighted examples that demonstrate this method in use at glamored institutions. Slide. So for example, one of our methods is reverse image lookup. The tools associated with that method are Bing Image Match, Google Image Search, 10i Match Engine, 10i Image Search, and Yandex. In some cases, the tools that we've selected to include in our toolkit are the full extent of tools that we could locate for the method in question, kind of like this one. But for other methods, there might be so many tools that we simply selected several that were the most commonly used or accessible to glamored institutions, or that had capabilities to do certain necessary functions for the assessment method in question. So the list of tools are not meant to be exhaustive in the case of methods like surveys or web analytics, where there are many, many tools that exist. Here you can see some screenshots of different sections from some of our different tools pages. As with our methods, the information on tools is organized into what we hope are straightforward and useful categories, such as how to use the tool specifically for use and reuse assessment, any ethical guidelines specific to this tool, strengths and weaknesses of the tool for each method that it applies to, including strengths and weaknesses specifically in comparison to the other tools that we're documenting. Any other tools that can be used for the same method, and real world examples if available as linkable case studies, articles, or blog posts. Slide. While our group is passionate about the need for this toolkit to exist, we cannot be the experts in every aspect of the content going into this toolkit. We've worked hard on the first drafts of these materials, but we very much value the feedback and assistance from this point forward from a variety of experts across different fields. And we hope that you will all consider contributing or sharing the call for feedback with your networks when we send it out later this spring. Keep your eyes open on the ARL Assist listserv and the DLF announced listservs.
Great, thank you, Joyce. All right, so looking ahead to wrap up, what's ahead for this project? So after the methods and tools for data collection are complete, the grant has another set of activities on the near-term horizon. Education tools and trainings will focus on pulling together what we're learning from best practices to develop modules focused on assessment of reuse of digital cultural heritage objects, things like tutorial guides, templates, other examples. Developing and delivering webinars and in-person training. In our grant, we have 3 in-person trainings that we said that we would provide. And then we also have grant funding for travel grants to really broaden engagement. And then we'll have continual engagement with and feedback from the glamored community of practitioners. All right, so excuse me. So we're also going to do some hiring in areas of expertise that will be needed for the second half of the grant, including instructional design and accessibility. And then we'll conclude with deliverables, including the toolkit that Joyce referred to, hosted on the DLF website. Okay, so we buzzed through that really quickly. I just want to pause and say our project website is linked here. This is the hashtag we normally use. And then these are our best ways to get in touch with us for any further conversation that we don't have time for here today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Joyce and Carolyn. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function and I will read the question for the speaker and the audience. So we have a couple questions to start with. One of them is, can you talk about how you're hoping this product in the end will be used in practice? So maybe foreshadowing a little bit of that professional development that you have intended. What are the outcomes that you're hoping for in terms of use of the end product?
Sure, and actually I can turn my video back on. It was getting a little buzzy with the slides and everything. So that's a really great question. So for us, the name of the game was utility for all of our deliverables. I mean, for something like the ethical guidelines, in some cases, we're really digging into areas that haven't been explored before, which is why our comments were so meaningful. People saying we haven't heard of this, but also you might have gotten it wrong in these particular cases. So utility, whether it's like dog-earing the guidelines, but also making it iterative, telling us kind of what we could be doing differently or what as a community we can be thinking about differently. We're really hoping, because the toolkit is going to live on a website, one, that it's iterative, but that templates and examples are a really sort of easy entry point for all community members, not just maybe the folks in this room, to get involved in really thinking about just not just sort of the ethical conversation around reuse data, but also the types of data that you have and the guidelines for continually assessing that data. So that's kind of the broad answer. I mean, specifically, we're hoping that people bring this into their workplaces or into their work streams and then kind of make it their own, but then tell us what you did differently so that we can either add it as a great example or a different description, or even kind of pivot or angle some of our thinking so that we can represent kind of the practices in the wild rather than just sort of, our box of a project team.
That's terrific. And there's also a question about whether you have plans for connecting with LIS programs to reach out, not to just current practitioners, but also pre-service.
That's a great idea. Joyce, do you recall I don't think we've had that conversation in particular, but I do know that when we sent out the ethical guidelines for open commenting, we did send it to a number of folks who later I learned were either very, very new to the LIS field or the museum field, sort of new to the Glamored field, or still enrolled in a library school. But we haven't thought specifically about that. So I'm going to write that down because that's a really, really good idea. And it's also interesting because a lot of those folks are really on kind of the bleeding edge of what we could be doing differently. So there might be some really valuable insight there. Great idea.
Okay, and then right now I only have one other question, which is, are there other places that you think this sort of approach could be taken, right? So can a similar document or this document be used in other contexts beyond the ones you've initially identified for it?
I think definitely we have seen that people would like to have ethical guidelines for reuse of digital content. A lot of people stumble that we're doing ethical guidelines for the assessment of reuse, and they're saying, hey, wait, these don't exist for reuse, and we really wish they did. So that's an area that a clear problem.
That's great. So back it up even off of assessment to just the reuse, basically. Okay, that makes sense to me. Is there anything that we should have asked that we as a community didn't ask that you'd like to talk about?
I mean, I have a whole series of backup slides, y'all, to anticipate some of the questions that you had. So if you're not asking them, we don't have to answer them.
All right, well, I hope that you'll also consider sharing those because now everyone wants to see them. So wherever you're sharing your materials other than at the conference website, I'm sure folks will be like digging for those Easter eggs, so to speak. So thank you, Carolyn and Joyce. That was fantastic. I really appreciate that presentation. we have Engagement Pathways to Transfer Student Success, presented by Ann Cooper Moore, the Dean of J. Murray Atkins Library at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and Becky Croxton, who is Head of Assessment at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte as well. Over to you, Becky and Ann.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session today. My name is Becky Croxton. I am the Head of Assessment at J. Murray Atkins Library at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte.
And I am Ann Cooper Moore, the Dean at J. Murray Atkins Library. And we are going to be discussing with you today a project that we're very excited about on engagement pathways to transfer student success. The impetus of this project is that transfer student enrollment is increasing at a faster rate than first-time in college freshmen. And according to the National Center for Education Statistics, from 2016 to 2018, there was a 0.2% decline in first-time in college freshman enrollment in post-secondary institutions, while simultaneously there was a 1.5% increase in transfer students. However, transfer students on average drop out before completing their degree at much higher rates than do first-time in college freshmen. The purpose of this study is to understand the role of out-of-the-classroom engagements in transfer student success in comparison to first-time in college freshmen. And by out-of-the-classroom engagements, we're talking about co-curricular, including library, and extracurricular engagements. And our purpose is in order to develop a deeper understanding of the factors that contribute to transfer student retention and success so that libraries and universities can structure appropriate support systems and services that will help transfer students succeed. So a little bit about UNC Charlotte, where the data for this study all comes from. It is an urban research institution with a greater Charlotte population of approximately 1.2 million people. It is, according to the Carnegie rating, a higher research activity doctoral university that is working on R1 status, and we have the second largest undergraduate enrollment in the 17-school UNC system behind NC State. In fall of 2020, we had just over 30,000 students, with 24,000 of them undergraduates, and we are a high transfer institution with 40% being transfer students, and those numbers are from that incoming fall 2020 class. So we have been working on this project, or the broader project related to all undergraduates, for about 3 years. And the project partners for the transfer student study are those highlighted in bolded in this. So in the co-curricular partners, we're including Library, Career Center, Tutoring, Writing Center, Education Abroad. We also have Learning Communities, First Year Writing, and the Registrar. For the extracurricular in this study, it includes Greek Life and the University Recreation Center. And then the Office of Academic Affairs Institutional Research helps us connect our data set to the Banner Student Information System to discover the other pieces that we need: the demographics, the pre-college behavior, and then all of the success measures. So this data set we've been working on for 6 years of data. It is a longitudinal data set at the individual student level of all of the undergraduate students who came into the university starting with the academic year 2012 through 2013. Now today we'll be dealing with the transfer students, but we have the larger all undergraduate data set. And that data set includes student engagements at the type of activity level. Pre-college data includes high school GPA, test scores, number of incoming credits. The demographic data are pretty standard. You can see them listed there. And for the measure of success data, we focused on 3 different measures: year-to-year retention, GPA, and graduation rates. So for the theoretical model, we're actually using 3 for this study of transfers. For all undergraduate, Tinto's model of student integration is by far the landmark study, and it talks about some precursor variables that students bring with them to the university. So that would be family background, skills, and prior education, as well as those personal factors, which are psychological, motivational, and other external factors such as their own personal situation, financial, work, family. Then the areas that the university can influence are the social integration of the students, so their peer interactions, social interactions, extracurricular activities, and then the academic integration, which are the co-curricular activities, including library, academic performance, and faculty interactions. All of these 4 factors influence the student's decision whether to stay at the institution or withdraw and go somewhere else. The other 2 models are transfer shock, which is Hill's 1965 model, and student attrition. Transfer shock is about the dip in GPA that transfer students typically experience in their first semester when coming into a 4-year institution. And student attrition is related to Tinto's, and it's about what are the factors influencing a student's decision to stay or withdraw. And you'll see on this model, we have superimposed my favorite color, purple, model on top that relates to the transfer students as opposed to all undergraduate students. So they bring in those same differences in prior education, such as going to a community college that had more support systems and might have had more rigid, less formal, less challenging educational processes, and was more like high school. They're external factors which are more complicated for transfer students because they have other factors such as they're non-traditional students and they may be working full-time and have families and children, and then personality factors. And then the influence that we have on transfers at the university is finding social fit, which is harder for transfers because they don't come in with peers from high school, and they have other interests than the life that is set up for that first-time freshman. And then there's their academic performance challenges, again, with managing at the higher ed institution. Okay, so in our previous research, we learned that there are particular co-curricular and extracurricular engagements that help to explain significant and noteworthy percentages of variance in retention, GPA, and time to graduation for undergraduate students. But in this study that focused on transfers, we found different results based on the measure of success being studied, the admission status, the number of incoming credits, and pre-college and demographic variables.
So with our understanding from the previous iterations of the study, this time we dug in a little deeper and conducted more sophisticated analyses in which we controlled for confounding variables using propensity score matching. We disaggregated the data based on first-time and college freshmen and transfer students and the number of incoming credits, and then use binary logistic regression to calculate the degree to which each type of engagement activity increased chances for success based on their population subgroup and the measure of success. So we use propensity score matching to control for pre-entry academic readiness, socioeconomic status, college of enrollment, underrepresented minority status, and participation in high impact practices offered at the university. And propensity scoring was useful because it helps to reduce the selection bias by equating groups based on a given set of covariates. We also controlled for admission status and incoming credits by creating population subgroups, which we used to analyze all of our data. So here we have the first time in college freshmen, and then we broke up the transfer students based on their number of incoming credits. So at our university, 24 credits is the minimum threshold to be considered a transfer student, and then those with 60 or more credits are transferring in with junior status. So before proceeding with trying to understand or determine the key engagement activities that increase odds for success, we first spent time conducting some comparative analyses using analysis of variance and post hoc analysis. Noteworthy findings indicated that first-time in college freshmen had significantly higher retention rates than all of the transfer subgroups. But with respect to six-year graduation rates, it was the transfers with 60 or more incoming credits who had significantly higher retention rates than all others, though with a small effect, while transfers with the lowest number of incoming credits had significantly lower retention rates than all other groups in this study. We also looked at four-year cumulative GPA across groups. The trends noted were very similar to those for six-year graduation, though this time the first time in college freshmen and the transfers with the 60 or more incoming credits earned significantly higher GPAs after 4 years than the two other transfer subgroups. We also did some comparative analyses to see whether there were differences among the four groups with respect to first-year co-curricular engagement patterns. So for total co-curricular engagements in the first year, we totaled up and then compared students' engagement with the library, the writing center, the tutoring center, and the career center. And findings indicated that transfer students with the lower numbers of incoming credits were significantly more engaged co-curricularly than the first time in college freshmen and the transfers with 60 or more incoming credits. With respect to library engagement overall, all transfer subgroups were found to significantly be more engaged with library activities than the first time in college freshman group. We also took a quick look at first year extracurricular engagement as measured by membership in Greek life and participation with the University Recreation Center. This time we noted that the first time in college freshmen were significantly more engaged than all transfer subgroups in extracurriculars, though with a small effect. And similarly, the transfers with the lower number of incoming credits were also more engaged extracurricularly than the other two transfer subgroups. And then finally, we looked at some specific types of library engagement, again, just to see the trends in first year engagement. And you can see that the trends change depending on the type of engagement. For example, participation in information literacy, the first time in college freshmen were significantly more likely to participate with information literacy. With respect to easy proxy authentications, that's kind of our gauge for engagement with library resources. You can see the freshmen and the transfers with 60 or more credits were more likely to engage with our academic resources. However, with respect to use of our library equipment like desktop computers, it was the transfer students with the lower number of incoming credits who used our equipment more. And then finally, the transfers with 60 or more credits were using our library study rooms more. And then moving on, with the understanding that the four subgroups differed significantly with respect to both measures of success and engagement behaviors, we had the confidence to proceed with calculating propensity scores to create engagement pathways for success for each of the libraries, for each of the studies subgroup. So what you see here are the top 5 engagement activities for each subgroup that increase the odds for second year of retention among all variables included in the study. And you can see that there are some commonalities between the 4 subgroups, but then there are also some nuances in behavior. And now on this screen, we're looking at a very similar matrix, except this time we're looking at the odds of earning above average GPA for each of the 4 subgroups. And this time the column headers are slightly different. This time Career Center came up into the equation, the University Center for Academic Excellence and the Writing Center. You can see that things are nuanced based on their population subgroup. And then similarly, the engagement pathways once again differ slightly depending, this time we're looking at graduating in 6 years or less. And you can see that the pathways do differ once again based on the population subgroup. For some subgroups, engagement in one thing may help increase odds for graduating, whereas in another subgroup, that item doesn't come up into the equation.
Okay, and we did find that our research supported the theories I mentioned earlier. Our findings support team choice theory, and that engagement in specific co-curricular and extracurricular activities significantly increases the odds for success. And our findings support the other 2 theories and indicate that on average, transfer students coming in with less than junior status are less likely to persist and have lower GPAs and 6-year graduation rates than first-time in college freshmen and then transfer students with junior status. The impact of our study is that it's the first of its kind to compare out-of-classroom engagement of transfers and first-time in college freshmen. It is a twofold model that we developed. We analyze typical engagement behaviors of students based on their enrollment and credit status and identified the key engagement activities that significantly increase each group's odds for success. We're going to continue working on this project to determine other precursor characteristics and co-curricular and extracurricular activities that we can add into our data set that relate to transfer student success, hopefully uncovering new pathways, additional pathways libraries and universities can emphasize to help transfer succeed. So we're ready to take your questions while you look at the references.
Thank you, Becky and Ann. That was really, really fun. And you got some love for the PowerPoint template in the chat. So, and also from me, I really appreciated it. So lots of questions for you all. The first one is, what was included in engagement with information literacy in this study?
It was the number of attendances in information literacy instruction, course-based information literacy instruction in the first year or in the first 4 years when we're looking at the 4-year cumulative GPA, or across the 6-year span when we're looking at the 6-year graduation rates.
Excellent. And then a second question is, did your research reveal anything more that we could do, libraries could do to support transfer students that we're not already doing?
One thing I would note is we have a lot of loaner laptops. I don't believe they're included in the computer logins, but that has been a recent thing that has been in great demand by non-traditional students. So that is another thing, meeting that need. And then the internet, the lack of reliable internet has been another issue that's been brought up repeatedly. So we have, we're coming up to about 325 loaner laptops. And so we'll be including that data set. But we presented this on campus on Tuesday, and we got a lot of interested parties who want to add their data. So there's going to be a lot more.
That's fantastic. That's great to hear that there was such a good reception. Actually, there's a question that's coming in from chat and also another one. So we are butting up against the break, but I'm going to go ahead and do the questions because we have the room. We have a break. I've got the mic and I've decided. Okay, so how did you manage all your partners? And it sounds like you're going to get more. Did that pose any challenges to doing the work in terms of, management and leadership on campus? I mean, obviously it's a benefit, right, to have lots of interested folks, but were there any challenges associated?
Right now, it's just the challenge of one person plus a part-time graduate assistant trying to do it all. You know, the library is coordinating the efforts. Every time we do a presentation, more partners say, oh my gosh, we want to participate, and they're so excited to contribute their data, but right now it's just kind of a 1.5 person show to manage the data. So it just takes a lot of really careful plans and steps to keep it all going. You know, the Office of Institutional Research and the larger Academic Affairs Administration has expressed, you know, they're trying to put together a data warehouse for the university, but we're kind of the precursors for that. You know, you know, we kind of got it all started, and it's like, oh yeah, we need to do this. Anne can correct me if I'm wrong, but
well, yeah, I'd like to add to that really the problem is from the service providers, their data is in all different systems, you know, all different formats. And that's the real struggle, is it's a sit down with each one of them who is interested in negotiate how we're going to wrestle that data. And that's the reason we have such limited extracurricular data, is because student affairs they want to be there now that they understand what they have to do, but to make those changes and pull it in from where the student organizations are and all these disparate systems is the challenge. The banner piece of it for what they have in institutional research is the easy part. It's the other stuff. And the library was relatively easy. It's the writing center was the hardest one.
Or Becky makes it look easy. Right. All right. So a couple more questions. One, have you made any fundamental changes in communication with faculty, with students, having to do with events or anything else, now that we know that there's you know, some linkages here? Has that changed the communication? I won't say necessarily marketing, but communication generally.
Well,
or do you imagine it might, right, in the future?
Well, for one thing, the provost is extremely interested in our Hiring Your Student Success librarian, who focuses particularly on transfer students and trying to get, and this has moved us towards the 3-credit class in information literacy that many of our librarians have wanted for years. And so we were on the sidelines in information literacy, and it's really put us back in the forefront where we should have been all along. So that's been a real positive. And of course, it positions the library in a very critical, to have a very critical role in the whole data flow of everything. That's why Becky and I wanted to jump into it. So setting the standard.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then two more, a little bit more concrete questions. What percentage of the students in this study are totally online? So maybe would not use the study room because of geographical location. I'm not sure if that means like right now because of,
the data set currently, the one, like we keep building on the data set, but the data set that's used for this analysis went through the end of the 2017-18 year. And so our online population, I don't know if it's less than 10% generally. You know, now there's a huge amount because of COVID, but typically I would say less than 10% of our student body. We're primarily a on-campus student body. So great question.
Okay, then last question from the audience, and then one from me for Anne. The one from the audience is, how do you define and measure engagement versus outreach? How do you define and measure engagement versus outreach there?
I wouldn't say we've necessarily begun to tackle the outreach component. I think knowing about our engagement and what works to help students succeed will influence our outreach activities. But for engagement, you know, we're looking at students' participation in uses, spaces, and or services, spaces, and resources, and we're counting the interactions. We're not counting, like, not looking at like what they're doing when they're borrowing our books or whatever. We're just counting participation in things or with things.
Right, sort of in a passive way, so to speak. So it's not like we are promoting doing anything to reach out to the students different than what we had been doing before. We're trying to watch their behavior.
Okay, and then my last question, which is the most important one of all, is it a requirement to be a dean of libraries in North Carolina to have a favorite color be purple? I worked for Susan Nutter a long time, and there was lots of purple carpeting in the previously.
It's amazing to me how many of the other 16 heads of UNC system libraries love purple. It's required.
It must be a litmus test at the interview stage. All right, thanks. So now we're going to head everyone into our second 15-minute break. Actually, it's not 15 minutes because I kept talking. Once again, we'll have music playing as your auditory cue if you step away from your computer, and we'll be back at 15 minutes past the hour. Thanks.
Fall of 2017. And in our very first conversation, we identified that we really need to get a handle not only on our own instructional program, but how that program related to the campus curriculum. And I first really thought that we could do something with a curriculum mapping exercise at the Information Literacy Summit in spring 2017. I'd heard about curriculum mapping exercises like from UNLV and Claremont colleges, of course, but it was actually our neighbors at University of Chicago with Rebecca Starkey and Julie Paisantini, who presented a much sort of simpler project just with spreadsheets. And that really helped me kind of rethink what we could do and what the goals would be. But I won't go through the whole timeline here, but it was very sort of, gradual stop and start, run into like some dead ends and then like pick back up again sort of project as you can see, but we just kept moving forward. And so to talk for a moment about the goals that we set for ourselves, I think the important thing was not to drive up more traffic or just have more instruction sessions overall as the goal. It really was to update our own understanding of our campus's undergraduate courses and syllabi and curriculum and identify gaps. And I think the other important piece of this, kind of big picture, was to rethink what we were delivering and how we were delivering it in terms of library sessions to the undergraduate courses, and really think about it kind of structurally. So I'm gonna pass this on to E because I really want her to feature the really great work she did here. And E, you might be muted.
Yes, apologies. First, we determined our project scope. We decided to map 100 to 500 level courses required for each undergraduate major. For each courses, we wanted to find out the following information. What are the prerequisites for each classes? Which degree program require that course? Are there any research assignment included? Was there a library session offered? And what were the library session learning outcomes? And all subject liaisons in our institution provide research and instructional service for their academic departments. Therefore, they were all invited and tasked with mapping courses in their assigned majors. To answer those questions, we collect all this data. So first, we put together all classes for each undergraduate major from academic catalog of the undergraduate bulletin. And second, we started to reach out to several campus departments and academic departments to collect our syllabi. And to be honest, we encountered some challenges and delays over here. Not everybody responded to us. Our most success was with one liaison reach out to academic program chairs and office assistants. And we also find some individual college departments, they list their course information, include syllabi on their website. So in all, we gathered 207 syllabi from 16 disciplines. Finally, we gathered instruction stats from LibInsight, which we use to record and analyze the instruction data. All findings were recorded on shared Google spreadsheets by subject liaisons. As I mentioned, we didn't receive syllabi from all majors, so we could only fill the form with the information we gathered. And once all the information was collected, we started our initial analysis. And we found a variety of intriguing results. I'm going to present what we learned by reviewing undergraduate curriculum, reviewing the syllabi and library instruction stats. So immediately we noticed there are some programs and courses were no longer offered. We also noticed some new programs and new courses offered for undergraduate students. And when we reviewed the core curriculum courses, each undergraduate student has to take all these core curriculum courses. But what we learned new was not all of those courses are necessarily required during the first semester or academic year. That includes the writing communication course, Humanity 200, and some other lower level courses. So that explains in some of those core curriculum classes, we found students from different years with mixed research experience and skills.
So one of the things about trying to find a new home for embedding information literacy was the curriculum was, in some programs, was very determined. There wasn't really any room. And so the provost actually directly asked me at one point, is there anything you can do without creating a new 4-credit course? And I said, well, we can probably do something. We can find something. And so there were 3 courses that we really keyed into as possibilities for creating an information literacy module. And the first was the ITP courses, or Intro to Professions. That's kind of like a Social 101 type course, but they were very uneven in what they actually required in terms of writing and research. The second one was the iPro, which is a sort of team-based project sort of thing, a cooperative sort of course. And we had a couple of pilots with them, which were promising, but the course itself was in such churn. It was really being rethought a lot and kept changing. It was not going to be a reliable place for us to structure something. So that really fell to the Humanities 200 course, which has this sort of English 100 sort of component with composition. But the challenge with that one is it was taught almost entirely by adjuncts. We really needed to get data, to get university administrative support to move forward with that. So I'll let you talk about that.
Yeah. Thank you. And by review, the second, we reviewed the syllabi, and we found the format and content of syllabi vary among different colleges, and some of the syllabi doesn't include any any assignments information at all. So we found syllabus doesn't tell us everything. From what we received, we noticed, as we expected, most human science courses were the ones most often include research assignments. And for STEM major courses, we found only 400 level courses have research assignments. And some of those courses we had never worked with before. So there's definitely opportunities for us for future outreach opportunities. Additionally, We reviewed syllabi for resource mentions, and we found only 16% of the mentioned resources supplied by the library. We had an overview of which program, which level courses had library instruction in the past. And this is not surprising. For most human science courses, we had instruction with, because a lot of them have research components. And for STEM major, we had some instruction for a few 100 level courses and a few 400 level courses. Some program, we never work with them. And the library instruction stats also told us that most of our instruction sessions are one-shot in-person sessions, which was not preferred by us, but we are just happy we got invited into their classes. And we found there are similar learning outcomes for all level courses in the same discipline. So that means students may be taking the same kind of library instruction in different classes. And we noticed not all of our librarians were engaging with ACRL framework for information literacy for higher education. So the findings provide some valuable data and information for us. There's definitely some significant challenge and unique challenge for us when we integrate information literacy into the university curriculum, but we also find there are great opportunities out there as well. So here are a few things we started. During the time when we filled the data and waiting for syllabi, the instruction team started a weekly workshop series to discuss our experience and perception of the ACRL framework for information literacy and look for ways to implement the framework in our teaching. And the instruction team met with a few subject liaisons who does instruction often. Together, we developed an instruction manual. So the instruction manual have a starter package with foundational information literacy skills that is recommended for entry-level classes, upper-level classes package with advanced research skills. And professors can choose a package when they schedule instruction session. The professors can also customize a library session by choosing their own learning objectives. On the full menu, under each skill, there's detailed learning objectives. So the detailed menu helps professors to see what information literacy skills librarians can teach and what we can do to help their students. And this menu we found is also helpful for liaisons when we plan for our instruction sessions, especially for the new liaisons or for some librarian who doesn't do instruction often. Another thing we started a new outreach effort by targeting specifically courses for collaboration. So we reach out to courses with research assignments and invite the faculty to submit an instruction request or have their students make research appointment with librarians. We also started building relationship with the core curriculum courses. I'm going to talk more about Humanity 200 in a minute. But one of the most important thing was instead of waiting for faculty submit request, we proactively reach out to faculty and invite them to submit instruction requests in the beginning of each semester. And we found the best time to reach out to faculty is 1 or 2 weeks before semester starts. That's when they were finalizing their syllabi, and we found there's higher chances for us to get invited into their classes. This approach helped us receiving faculty response more than ever, and we started to work with classes and programs that we never worked with before. And now, thanks to the library's administration effort, we started a pilot program with Humanity 200 classes in the spring 2020 semester. We worked with 5 classes in total, and each class we had 2 library sessions, which covered basic information literacy skills. And we helped the faculty add a research component in their class and added an annotated bibliography assignment, which is also graded by librarian. This pilot program identified and addressed gaps in students' knowledge and demonstrates how an information literacy program can improve their skills. We continued working with some Humanities 200 classes in the fall 2020 semester and the spring 2021 semester. The pandemic didn't stop us. We're working on to get library session embedded into all Humanities 200 classes. And finally, we see a need to supporting liaison teaching from the findings. So we put together instruction toolkit with recommended tools, recommended resources to help liaison to plan for instruction session. There are suggested content, suggested slides and classroom activity. And also in our bi-weekly liaison meeting, we add a part to discuss our teaching, what problem we ran into, what we learned from other conference, or what we learned about teaching.
So the practical implications of this were that, we found a real lack of awareness of library services and let alone instruction, even of resources being mentioned in the syllabi. But this gave us an opportunity to really recast the narrative about what we offer and what we could offer. So really changing the how to library tour sort of mentality to what skills can we help impart. And so the instruction menu really gave us a chance not only to manage expectations, but also something to point back to when we had these conversations across campus with VPs and deans and chairs. And those conversations, it was so helpful to me because inevitably, the conversation at some point would turn to what's communication and what information literacy skills do our students have, and having this data on hand, having these reports on hand that we were created for certain groups, being able to just come in and pounce on that and have solutions ready really helped move conversations forward significantly. So in conclusion, I would say this was a really, obviously a slow and steady process. It took a lot of adjustment, but there were immediate and actionable insights that we were able to use. Our instruction numbers immediately began to climb because we knew who we were, who we were wanting to talk to, what we could offer, and what would be most valuable. And I think our fall instruction numbers doubled just over the 2-year period, even before we implemented this Humanities 200 pilot. So there was, I think the value of persistence and taking initiative in cross-campus opportunities is was really held up here. And so what we'd like to leave you with is a few sources that helped guide us as we started out these conversations. And we'd love to hear your questions and feedback. I think we already at least have one.
We do have one. So one of the questions that we can address is how many individuals contributed to gathering and analyzing the data?
So, we're what I would call a mid-sized academic library. We have about 10 to 12 liaisons. And I would say, it's probably with turnover, probably about 12 people at various points from the library reaching out to gather that information. Now, of course, we reached out to a number of areas like the Teaching and Learning Center, our Blackboard manager, and the registrar and other things. So, we got a lot of feedback from different sort of sources, but on our side, it was about, 10 to 12 people consistently, reaching out and doing the work. And really the crux of it really fell on E to gather and collate all this.
Wonderful. And if anyone, if you're sitting on questions, audience members, please put those in the Q&A section so that we can get to them. Another question that we have is about the challenge and how to end run or overcome those challenges around syllabus studies and the inconsistency, I'm sure, across faculty, across departments, across, and so on, and that, and how to get those assignment descriptions when they're not in the syllabus. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
I feel one of the big thing is patience. I feel like we've been waiting forever to receiving a lot of the syllabi, but as Devin mentioned, some of the just being consistent and keep reaching back to the faculty and also exploring other ways to receiving the receiving the content, like we exploring the department website report, like exploring the website. So we were able to find something, and also depends on the relationship between liaison to the academic program. We found most of the syllabi received are the program we work closely. So that helps a lot.
So, and I would just add, I think one really great example of what you're, I think, asking, Megan, is the Humanities 200 course itself, which had very different learning outcomes and assignments across all the different adjuncts that were, doing the class. So when we could get multiple copies of one course or section and really compare like what the expectation was for a learning outcome or assignment somewhere in that course or section, that may not be reflected in a particular syllabus, but was in with different instructors. That was really helpful to us to identify, look, this could be a place where we could really help.
That's fantastic. So I'm trying to keep us on time, but we just got like 3 great questions. So if you'd be willing to respond typing, and then if we can't get to those, or if that's not a good way to describe it or explain it, we've got that session at the end that we can come back to these questions, because you just got 3 great questions. All right. Continuing on, trying to stay on time. I'm not, though. I'm not. All right. So our next presentation is developing an assessment plan for a 100 level information literacy courses at the University of Northern Colorado, presented by Brianne Markowski, the head of information literacy and undergraduate support at the University of Northern Colorado, Lyda McCartin, the interim director of the Center for Enhancement of Teaching and Learning at the University of Northern Colorado, and Stephanie Evers, the information literacy librarian at the University of Northern Colorado, all of whom I think had to dig out this week. Brianne, Lyda, and Stephanie, it's over to you.
My name is Brianne Markowski. I'm the head of information literacy and undergraduate support at the University of Northern Colorado. And today, we'll be talking about how we developed a plan for assessing our 100 level information literacy credit courses. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Lyda McCartin, director of the Center for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning, and formerly the head of our department, and Stephanie Evers, who's an information literacy librarian in our department. I also wanted to briefly recognize the current and former members of the library's curriculum committee who helped to collaboratively develop the assessment plan that we'll be talking about today. Before we get into the assessment plan, I wanted to provide just a little bit of context about our institution and our LIB credit course program. So the University of Northern Colorado is a mid-sized state school located in Greeley, Colorado. We have an enrollment of just under 10,000 undergraduate students. And in the early 2000s, our library began offering a credit-bearing information literacy course, LIB 150, Introduction to Undergraduate Research. And since that time, our credit course program has grown to include 6 distinct 100-level credit courses, which are part of degree requirements for programs across campus. Currently, we teach about 15 courses each year, reaching approximately 300 students. So the curriculum of the LIB credit course program is overseen by our library's curriculum committee, and this committee is made up of all of the faculty librarians who teach the LIB credit courses. When the ACRL framework for information literacy for higher education was released, our curriculum committee decided to revise the shared student learning outcomes for our 100 level information literacy courses. We developed the student learning outcomes shown here through a collaborative process that we've previously described in an article in College and Research Library News. We'll put a link to the article in the chat if you want to read more about the process of developing the SLOs. But after we finished revising our shared outcomes, so back in 2015, we began talking about how we could assess these student learning outcomes, not just in each of our individual courses, but across courses and instructors. So like the process that we followed for developing the student learning outcomes, the work of developing the assessments and later the assessment plan was accomplished collaboratively in our library's curriculum committee. So we've described the assessments for each student learning outcome and the assessment plan in more detail in the conference proceedings. But today we wanted to focus on how we got there, because even though we were assessing shared credit course student learning outcomes, we think that this process could be used by other libraries looking to assess libraries-wide student learning outcomes for one-shot or embedded instruction programs. As I've said before, this was a collaborative process. So it was not just one person who was responsible for doing all of the assessment work. And in our view, collaboratively developing an assessment plan has a number of benefits. So first, just having an assessment plan has allowed us to assess student learning across courses and instructors in a systematic way. The plan that we've developed outlines a method for assessing each student learning outcome and a schedule for when data are collected and analyzed. It also outlines who's responsible for this work and how those results are later shared. So second, collaboratively developing the assessments has led to really valuable conversations among our librarians about what we teach and why. It's also encouraged us to discuss different strategies for teaching as we look at student achievement across our courses. And ultimately, implementing this plan for systematically assessing student learning outcomes has improved teaching and student learning in our 100-level information literacy courses. So I'm going to turn it over to Lyda now, who will talk about how we developed the assessment plan.
To develop an assessment plan collaboratively and, most important, efficiently, we followed a 5-step process, which we established working through the first student learning outcome and signature assignment development, and then we use that for the remaining 3 student learning outcomes. The first step is to develop the signature assignment for the student learning outcome. And a signature assignment is a course embedded assignment, activity, or project or exam that is collaboratively created by instructors to collect evidence for a specific learning outcome. To develop the signature assignment, each curriculum committee member proposed assignments for that learning outcome based on how we were already assessing that outcome in our courses. We also looked at the literature for other assessment ideas. At a meeting, each librarian presented their idea, and after debating pros and cons of each, we agreed upon a signature assignment to pilot. Sometimes this meant combining 2 or more ideas into one assignment. Teams of 2 were then assigned to develop the signature assignment, including the assignment instructions and scoring plan. The draft was brought back to a meeting where it was discussed and edited before moving to step 2, and step 1 took about 3 to 4 weeks. Once the assignment was developed, we started step 2, which was to run a pilot in order to evaluate how that signature assignment would work in the classroom. The 2 librarians who developed the signature assignment embedded that assignment into their courses and collected data from students in their course sections. After the assignment was completed and graded, they reported back any issues and we revised the assignment again. Steps 2 and 3 were done simultaneously. So while the pilot was underway, we determined an analysis process for the data by looking for examples of how others had assessed similar learning outcomes and modifying those procedures to fit our needs. In some cases, we had to develop that process from scratch. This resulted in the development of a rubric of some kind. And at the end of the semester, we tested the analysis procedure on the data collected from the pilot. After we collected pilot data, we began step 4 and set an achievement benchmark for the full implementation of the signature assignment. After discussing the results from the pilot, we agreed upon the initial benchmark level of achievement for that learning outcome. For example, the benchmark for SLO1 is 75% of students will achieve surface or deep learning. This benchmark would then be used to measure our success in achieving that learning outcome beyond the pilot phase. Step 4 is also a time to revise the signature assignment and even the SLO if you realize that the assignment is not assessing what you had hoped or that the learning outcome isn't really what you want to be assessing. And we experienced this, and Stephanie's going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. You want to be sure to document the assessment method for the SLO. So we kept detailed process documents for the signature assignment, the data collection process, and analysis process. You want to do this throughout your planning and implementation, but it's step 5 because we finalized an official document after the pilot phase was complete. So after we completed all 5 steps, we then implemented the signature assignment in all of our courses. So after that pilot phase where the signature assignment was in 2 courses, we implemented the assessment in all sections of the 100 level course. And then we began that process again with the next student learning outcome. So this is an example of a piece of our assessment plan. And in 2019, after working through this process for each learning outcome, we finalized the plan. So now we are collecting assessment data for each SLO through the course embedded signature assignments every semester. Instructors are responsible for gathering student artifacts from their courses, and this is done mainly through our course management system. And the instructors give the artifacts to our administrative assistant, and that person de-identifies and organizes the artifacts for analysis. The curriculum committee is responsible for the analysis of the artifacts. So in our assessment plan, we decided to analyze data for 2 learning outcomes each year. So in odd years, we analyzed data for SLO 1 and 3, and then in even years, we analyzed data for SLOs 2 and 4. This allows us to see the effects of our interventions on student learning regularly. Most of the analysis occurs during a day-long assessment retreat at the end of the spring semester. After the committee has analyzed and discussed the data, the chair of the committee is responsible for writing a report summarizing the assessment results, and that report is shared with the committee and with our dean and associate dean. One last note about our assessment plan, we did use our university's assessment plan template for program assessment, and we recommend using your institution's template if they have one. So now I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie to discuss our lessons learned.
All right, so going through this process, we learned some lessons along the way, including an initial unrealistic timeline, the need to remain flexible, importance of documenting everything, and fostering instructor buy-in. We initially imagined a timeline that looks like this for the overall assessment project, which was nice and tidy and had us developing the assignment, piloting it, and determining the analysis for each SLO each year. In reality, the timeline looked more like this. As we figured out what assignments worked or didn't work and put analysis procedures in place, we found it necessary to revisit steps along the way. So though not as tidy as we'd initially hoped for, by being flexible, it made for a better overall process and product. Flexibility is necessary in this process, as demonstrated by the changing timeline. We also found ourselves needing to be flexible as we revised signature assignments, student learning outcomes, or data collection procedures several times throughout the process. You can see here the changes that we made from the SLOs we started with to what we ended up with a few years into the process. Our SLOs changed as we piloted assignments and discovered that perhaps the assignments, and therefore the SLOs, were not measuring what we wanted them to, or the assignments were actually measuring something not reflected in our SLOs. Another lesson learned is to document everything, as we would have some involved conversations in our meetings and then need to remember what we had talked about when the topic would come up again later, sometimes years later. An example was in the development of a signature assignment where we had an instructor who had particular reasons to include certain elements in that assignment. But then after the faculty member left the institution and we were again looking at the assignment, we could not remember the reasons why this element was included. So it was helpful to be able to go back and look at prior meeting notes for clarification. Finally, work towards establishing buy-in from all the committee members who teach the classes and are involved in the project by ensuring a collaborative process. We made sure to share the workload by having different pairs of committee members work together to develop assignments, rubrics, or other elements after we solicited ideas from all involved. Our discussions in either our monthly committee meetings or our biannual assessment retreats also allowed space for debate and eventual consensus on how to proceed. This was particularly important as we had instructor turnover and needed to ensure that new committee members were comfortable with all the components of the assessment process. So that is how we went about developing and implementing a program level assessment plan. And now we'll open it up for any questions.
Wonderful. That's really exciting. And we've got some questions we have questions to answer. So that's super great too. So the first question is this: how did you approach course faculty for this pilot?
So we are the course faculty. In this case, so the librarians are the faculty teaching the one. I don't know if you can remember back to how this was initially brought to the committee.
Yes, so we had the student learning outcomes in place, and then I think that article on how we developed those was shared in the chat, so you can read through that. And so the next phase of that was to determine how we were going to actually assess those learning outcomes. And so I think a lot of times we develop learning outcomes and then we don't go to that next phase of, okay, well, now what do we do? And so I brought the idea to the curriculum committee that we should consider signature assignments. And because by definition, signature assignments are collaboratively developed. And so that was sort of the key, that the only way we were really going to be able to assess across the courses was to all do the same assessment. And so when I brought the idea to the curriculum committee, I made sure to stress that we were going to collaboratively create these. So everybody's opinion was going to matter in terms of how we were going to assess these outcomes. And that I wasn't saying that you have to change your pedagogy in any way. So each instructor has autonomy over how they teach their course. And I think I said something along the lines of, if you want to teach search skills through interpretive dance, you are certainly can certainly do that. But that we were going to have these particular assessments to assess the program outcomes. And what then developed is that these are assessments that can be used as part of the course grade, but separately they're used for the program assessment. And so that's kind of how I approached it, which is I wanted everybody to kind of be on board, but to recognize that this wasn't going to impact how they wanted to teach their class, and they could do anything that they wanted to within reason in their class to get students to outcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The next question is, could you describe the signature assignment or assignments in more detail?
So there's a lot to this, so I can do it kind of briefly. And then I think we linked the assessment plan in the chat, which has more of the details in it. And we also we'll include a little bit more detail in the conference proceedings. But so the signature assignments for SLO1, developing a research process, we are looking at how asking students to map their research process at the first day of the class and the last day of the class, and then we're looking for change in their research time to
Brianne, you're breaking up a little bit. Can you type? Is it possible to turn off your camera to save bandwidth so we can hear your answer?
Yes. Brief writing.
Take two. Let's try that again.
Did we lose Brianne?
I don't know. I think she's still here, but we're having trouble hearing what she said.
I'm going to kill my video.
Great idea. Let's do that. Okay. Okay, we need you to unmute as well.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. My internet is acting up. So did I?
So you were saying about how there's lots of places we can look for those things. but then you were going on, I think, to some specifics.
Okay. Wow, then, okay. So for the SLO1, which is develop a research process, we use a concept map that the students do toward the beginning of the semester and then again at the end of the semester. And then we look at that to see how they're thinking about the research process has changed. For the second SLO, which is effective search strategies, we look at a reflective writing prompt that the students do about their kind of search processes and which searches were most effective. And then we gather those at the end of the semester and apply a rubric to it. For SLO3, which is evaluate information, we give the students kind of a scenario, sample research question and a series of 6 articles, and we ask them to choose and which articles they would use if this was their research topic and to justify their choices based on their evaluation. And then the final SLO, we look, which is use evidence to support an argument. We look at the final research assignment that they complete in the course. So sometimes it's an annotated outline, sometimes it's a poster, sometimes it's a presentation where the students need to use evidence to answer a research question. And then we have a rubric that we apply to that. So that is the quick overview of what our signature assignments look like.
Thank you so much. All the rubrics, I have to go check them out. All right, thank you, Brianne, Lyda, and Stephanie. That was fantastic. So our final presentation is Assessing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in Academic Libraries, presented by Clare Thorpe, who is Acting Director of Library Services at the University of Southern Queensland.
Good morning and good afternoon. I'd like to begin by acknowledging my co-author, Lyndall Gunton, who's unable to be with us today. In Australia, we begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands and the waterways where our university is based, and we pay respect to elders past, present and future. We celebrate the continuous living cultures of First Australians, and we acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have played in Australian society. We welcome and pay respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, Indigenous and First Nations people joining us today. The United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is a shared blueprint for peace, prosperity, people, and the planet. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets, which drive global action at a local level. The goals are not legally binding. However, they have extensive global and local support and will be a major influence on government, business and organisations over the remainder of this decade. The goals have been welcomed by libraries and were developed in conjunction with IFLA. While sustainable development and academic library assessment may be considered separate areas of interest, the increasing prominence of the goals amongst funding bodies and stakeholders provides a driver for incorporating them into library assessment frameworks. The goals can act as social justice metrics by examining local activities through a global lens. And the 17 goals are useful in reflecting on and examining local practice and as a tool for organisational benchmarking. They are a valuable addition to the library assessment toolkit, either used alone or as benchmarking tools at international, national or local levels. IFLA, who, as I mentioned, contributed to the development of the goals, recommends using a combination of both metrics and narrative stories to report on and measure progress. And it's this emphasis on anecdotal evidence and narratives that is one distinguishing feature of how the goals are being measured and reported on. So there are different ways that organisations and countries have looked at how to engage with the goals. And this includes raising awareness, identifying capability, identifying opportunities for collaboration, and measuring and reporting progress. On screen, you'll see 5 steps that are proposed, particularly for the university sector, of which my library is part. And this ranges from mapping to monitoring and evaluation. So this 5-step process is one that libraries can consider adopting. And it is this challenge in the variety of assessment processes that have been used for the goals, which does make it difficult when considering how libraries might assess and report on them. When used to demonstrate libraries' contributions to sustainable development, it can be difficult to demonstrate causation. And as such, starting at step 1 with the mapping approach, rather than jumping straight to measurement, is a logical first step. Mapping examples include using things such as desktop assessment, self-identification, and keyword searching. When we were beginning to interact with the goals, we looked for assessment frameworks for academic libraries, and at that time, there were none. What we did find is an example from public libraries in Portugal, which, as you can see on screen, moves through a number of different levels. The authors suggest that a library's contribution to sustainable development can show achievement towards a goal, can show how library initiatives align with the goal, and can show how libraries understand their impact on stakeholders. While this model has only been designed and tested with public libraries, it's possible that it could provide a model that is relevant to academic and university libraries. Lyndall and I work at the University of Southern Queensland, a multi-campus regional university in southeast Queensland. We have approximately 27,000 undergraduate and postgraduate students who are mostly mature age and pre-pandemic were studying online. USQ has a strong social justice history, being a provider of distance education for more than 40 years, and we are also the largest provider of tertiary education into correctional centres in Australia, where we provide online like study experiences to students without requiring a connection to the internet. In 2019, USQ library staff stepped through an exercise to understand how our day-to-day work and our annual stretch targets mapped to the 17 goals. This was a proof of concept exercise to determine if it was at all possible to fit our activities to the goals. We conducted desktop assessments and self-identification, gathering evidence through inference and observation to provide clear descriptions of projects and business as usual activities. We conducted the mapping at the macro level, looking only at the 17 goals and not the 169 targets. As our first mapping activity, we did not consider or try to find causation. Mapping activities were peer-reviewed, and draft metrics were identified as possible sources of ongoing impact evidence. Our teams found that we mapped our activities to 8 of the 17 goals. This high-level mapping activity and reporting was an educative and awareness-raising opportunity, which we initially focused only on library staff. As such, it introduced staff to the relevance of both of the goals to both the university and the library's context, and gave us an opportunity to explore and understand our work and our stretch targets against a global agenda. As the process continued, the results that we generated proved useful in demonstrating our value and impact to of the university library to the wider community that we serve. And so we were able to table formal reports with our Pro-Vice-Chancellor Education and subsequently to the Vice-Chancellor's executive team. We also considered informal ways of reporting and sharing this information more widely with our professional industry. As a way of developing our staff's digital literacy skills, we experimented with the online presentation tool Microsoft Sway and documented both metrics and narrative stories to describe how our library mapped our activities to those 8 goals. And you can see some excerpts from the sway on screen. So we found a number of benefits around engaging our staff with the library with the Sustainable Development Goals. And it certainly provided an opportunity for us to demonstrate our positive influence, value and impact by looking through a local and global lens. We succeeded in raising awareness both within and beyond the library. And staff and clients have subsequently engaged in conversations around those challenges of sustainability. Both the formal and informal reporting strategies were successful in providing evidence around our positive impact. An unexpected outcome was that the mapping exercise resonated quite personally with a number of library staff. Team members were able to identify a direct connection between the work that they do as individuals and the impact that they can have on global sustainability. As such, they developed a feeling of strong affinity about how their professional skills and knowledge contribute to the goals. However, it is difficult to map information about our activities to the goals, and we found that a number of activities sat across more than one goal. As mentioned, we did not find any existing frameworks on which to base our mapping activity. So we have mapped our own baseline, which we intend to use in the future to measure progress. While we did initially flag potential quantitative or qualitative metrics to support the mapping, assigning these and finding the actual numbers and stories did prove that it required more time and effort than we had. And some indicators, such as employment diversity indicators, open access percentages and like, were easy to get. We weren't able to test these metrics as far as ongoing progress yet. It is easy to turn the goals into a simple checklist exercise, but we would argue that the goals should be used rather as a critical instrument to consider sustainability within business decisions and policies and practices, rather than just ticking a box. Our journey with the Sustainable Development Goals has focused mostly on mapping our baseline and building capacity and awareness among our staff. A second iteration of the mapping exercise in 2020 engaged even more of our team members and demonstrated a growing recognition of the relevance of goals to the work of the library and the university community. As we head into the coming year, we are focusing on monitoring and evaluating our progress against this baseline evidence and identifying priority areas for development and gaps in our current service offer. And as we've reflected on the mapping exercise, we think there are 5 ways in which academic libraries can consider engaging with the goals. Firstly, at the personal level. As mentioned, library staff resonated personally and connected their individual values to their work in the light of the goals. At the organisational level within the library, the goals provided a tool to measure our impact and to engage in advocacy and explore new reporting strategies. Within the university, the library had the opportunity to promote and advocate for sustainable development and to report these to the highest possible levels. Nationally, we've identified the need for industry benchmarks amongst Australian university libraries that can be used to measure and map work within our sector. And globally, we are looking at contributing to IFLA's Library Map of the World. The effect of undertaking these mapping exercises has led to ongoing conversations, and we now consider the goals a key external driver for our planning cycles. The Sustainable Development Goals provide a remarkable and unique common platform which society, governments and organisations such as libraries can contribute to. As traditional assumptions about academic libraries are being re-questioned or rethought in the post-pandemic era, the goals remain relevant as a way for libraries to demonstrate value, impact and relevance to their local community. And we would argue that the need for global sustainability action is even more pressing following recent devastating bushfires in Australia, extreme weather conditions, and of course, COVID-19. So we encourage you to become familiar with the goals, to consider how your library may already be contributing to the goals, and to use this as a tool for advocacy in your community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was fascinating. So I have a couple questions for you. There's a question about the mapping and what that looked like on a very concrete, practical level, and what the peer review of that was like. Can you share a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So the mapping, I guess, is not terribly sophisticated. It was essentially a spreadsheet exercise, as all good mapping exercises are. What we did was, as I mentioned in the presentation, there are 17 goals, and we really basically did an audit of everything that we do in the library, from information literacy to the way that we engage with our collections and our description, the student ambassadors that we employ as our assistant library officers. We considered all aspects of our business, from human resources to collection management to outreach. And we looked at which of those goals those activities may relate to or correlate to. And that's how we really got from the 17 macro goals to really identifying that the work that we do around open textbooks, around employment diversity, around digital literacy and digital dexterity, our makerspace, really do show alignment with the goals, the 8 goals that we rationalised it down to. So the peer review was, most of this work was coordinated by Lyndall Gunton, who at the time was our coordinator evidence-based practice. So she worked with a number of team members to initially source the stories, and then we asked other staff members to review those to see whether or not our initial identification with one or more goals was actually correct.
Oh, fascinating. That sounds like fun. Do you have advice for those of us who might want to follow in the footsteps, suggestions for how we might do it, or mistakes we could avoid?
Look, I don't think you can make mistakes with engaging with the goals. I think it is a matter of just starting and seeing how the goals might apply in your local context. We obviously I don't say obviously, but at USQ Library, we've been really working towards building a culture of evidence-based practice for the last 4 years. And so this was a natural, practical example of gathering evidence, analysing it, and reporting for staff to step through. So as well as being a really important demonstration of our commitment to sustainable development, it was also a really practical application of engaging with evidence-based practice, and gave staff something to actually really engage with, rather than evidence-based practice or assessment just being this term that we talk about all the time. So certainly, look, I don't think you can make any mistakes. As I mentioned, there are no existing frameworks for how to do this in academic libraries. I would love for someone to maybe take that on board and get involved in potentially developing one, because we didn't find anything that we could use. So we really were making it up as we went along. And as I said, essentially what we've done, and we've done it twice now, is map a baseline and work on our storytelling skills. They were really the 2 major areas of focus. And as we move into this year, what I'm really keen to do now is to go back and work out where the gaps are, where we can actually demonstrate progress against those baseline areas, and pick some key focus areas where we can really more deeply engage with 1 or 2 goals in particular that align with our action plan for 2021.
You're getting some really positive feedback in the chat as well, and also I think this is because of time, our last question. Do you anticipate creating any kind of materials or toolkit for other librarians to be able to follow in this work? Since you couldn't find anything and had to make your own path, I think others would like to be able to draw on what you've done.
I think that's something we could certainly consider. I'll have a chat to Lyndall, because this is really her baby. What we are going to be publishing very shortly in the next month is actually our 2020 report. We're going to put that on our Open Textbooks Pressbook site so it can be easily accessible. So we're doing a slightly different approach to reporting and sharing this more widely this year, plus also coming here and raising awareness of this. I would really encourage people to have a look. Very keen to talk to anyone else. I don't think we should be the only ones developing the framework. I think it really needs to be both industry-wide and internationally. These are not just relevant to us here in Australia. They're very, very important, particularly, and have a lot of traction in the developing world and the global south, probably less so in Western countries like Australia. So really keen to work with anyone who might be interested in maybe co-creating a framework that we could all potentially test in our universities.
I hope everyone heard that. All right, thank you, Claire, so much for that presentation. We now have about 10 minutes for additional questions, and I'll invite all of our presenters to turn their videos back on for an open Q&A. My co-moderator, Clara, will take the mic for this part of the session.
Thanks, Megan, and thank you so much for shepherding us through this afternoon, and thanks to everyone who is joining us for the Q&A. So I'm going to invite everyone to share their last questions for any of the presenters, any of the teams in the Q&A or in the chat. And in the meantime, I'll start us off by asking everyone to share just one thing about your project, and we'll go in the order that you presented. And the question is, what are you most excited to do next with the project that you talked about today? And maybe Lisa and Karen, I'll invite one of you to go next.
And we are coordinated, so we even know who gets to go next. So I'm going to say that I think from the perspective of the project itself, what we're excited about is the fact that we're responding to our participants who have sort of said, we'd like to step this up and to work on collective library value investigations together. And then, of course, since we're evaluating a program where we teach people to do assessment, from an evaluation question, our next challenge then, that's an exciting one, is to say, okay, how do we understand the impact of people doing collaborative projects on the state of Illinois, but then also how do we understand that back to their campus? So what's the value to a campus of participating in a collaborative project? So we're sort of taking what we did in the first 2 years and we're almost inverting it for the second 2 years. And so I'm really excited about that.
Thank you, Lisa. And Aaron, the next presenter, is not here with us live, so we'll skip him and move on to Felix, Doreen, Stephanie, and Ken.
Yeah, I think we have a few different perspectives on the way forward. So I'll let each person who's here to just share really briefly on that. Doreen, do you want to get us going?
Sure. I guess what I'm most excited about next is getting pipelines of library data to see where we can enhance what we're already understanding and to reach out to potential campus partners who are already engaged in some learning analytics projects to see if library data would significantly enhance in any way their work. So those are the two things that I guess I would be most excited about.
Thanks, Doreen. Ken.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm most excited about is figuring out ways to deal with all of our collective libraries' idiosyncratic data in a more standardized way. And a related grant that I was worked on, parallel with the grant that Felix described, has helped tried to work on something like that through a caliper profile. I'm hoping that we can extend what we've done at Michigan and what we figured out about our own data to help us look at our data collectively together in different ways without having to reinvent lots of data transformation wheels.
All right, so I guess I go last. So in addition to just doing more probes for undergrads, we're really excited about, we have different lines of analysis for different groups on campus, grad students and faculty, and would like to see those through and hopefully share the findings in a setting like such as this one. But the other component for a project is sharing what we know and helping others be able to do what we've been doing so far. And I just shared with the panelists a link to our GitHub site. So this was our first attempt at doing that. And we're getting feedback from, we have an advisory group of, I would say, is it 14 or 15 other institutions? And so, and we've tried to also have workshops and share that, but we're very open to feedback on, how can we best disseminate or share what we've learned in doing this to others who are interested in doing the same thing at the institutions.
That's great. I'm already hearing potentially some presentations for the 2022 Library Assessment Conference cooking up here. Okay, moving in the same order, Michael and Andrew.
I think Andrew had to step away, so I can go ahead and answer for us. I think one of the things that we're most excited about is first the scenario-based work. We're literally about to start next week to really sit down with students and run them through some scenarios based around real learning analytics projects to understand where they see themselves in those projects as individuals. I think that's going to be one of the things that I'm really excited to learn right now. And I think the other thing is building on the actual survey data is being able to field this in a much larger setting where we can start to understand some of those demographic differences, how people from different ethnic backgrounds or different gender backgrounds really understand privacy and why that's important to them and why that's an important and sort of foundational aspect of their education. So those are really the things that I'm super excited about right now. So hopefully looking forward to sharing more about that with everyone soon.
Thank you, Michael. And now Chan, Becky, and Mohamed.
I can start. So for our project, the thing that I'm most excited is that there are more transformative agreements that just started at Berkeley and at other institutions as well. So it will be really interesting to see like how those agreements, the transformative OA agreements, make any impact on the actual OA publishing output, and also how that affect our faculty or authors' perception around OA as well. And then also related to how they use their funding to publish those OA articles. Those would be my things. Becky and Mohamed, anything to add?
I don't have anything to add. I agree that, I mean, there's lots of different directions we can take this, and we did talk about some of them during the talk, but I think that, the transformative agreements are really exciting. And then we just found it really interesting to say, oh, wait a minute, these articles have, like, I see people's requests for the APC funds from the library, at least the people in my liaison areas. And then every time I kept looking them up, I said, oh, wait, in Scopus, it already says that that they have research funding. So it was just kind of interesting to think, okay, well, we're using this. Does the article report funding in Scopus, but it seems like that doesn't necessarily mean that people have money for the APCs. So just trying to kind of dig in a little more to that, I think would be interesting and help strengthen some of our analyses.
Mohamed, I'm not seeing you on screen, but if you're here and have something to add.
I don't think
he's hearing anything. I do think that we're going to see open access move forward leaps and bounds in the next few years. So it'll be really interesting to see how attitudes and practices change going forward. Thank you for that. Joyce and Caroline, you're next. All right, it's after 5 p.m. in some places. So if Joyce and Caroline have to step away, we'll move back. Joyce and Caroline, if you're here and you're having technical issues unmuting, just pop a message in the chat and I'll come back to you. But we'll move on now to Qiong.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you all for your patience. Apologies again for the technical issue earlier. And so, yeah, next step, most exciting thing for me is to, because based on the preliminary fundings, I would like to collect more data. And so once I got more a bigger sample size, I would like to validate my findings. And also I have some qualitative interviews going on. So I would like to get more data analysis so that I hope I can find more meaningful findings to support my the current fundings, and also may get more fundings. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Moving on to Anne and Becky.
Yes. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. So I think that I'm really interested to find out which type of institution our transfer students are coming from, because our data set includes students coming from community colleges, from private institutions, and from other UNC system in schools. So they could have transferred from another four-year school to UNC Charlotte. So I'd like to dig down into that. We had a question on campus about what specific courses, levels of courses did these students take? And I think I'm particularly interested in delving into, did they take the two introductory courses, the first year freshman courses that have information literacy components in them? That's the real rub from my perspective as to why the library is such an impact and why they're using, more logons to computers and more resources than the first-time freshmen. And then also we need to dig in more deeply to the other extracurricular activities that they're doing, because of the finding that transfer students are more interested in academics when they go into the four-year institution than they are in the traditional first-time freshman social life. So we really need to delve into more the academic clubs, which of these students are in those, and that kind of more detail about their other activity, their extracurricular activities. Becky.
Oh gosh, I could talk all day, but I'll try to keep it short. I'm really excited about, of course, our data set's longitudinal and we continue to add each year. So, the more years of data, the better, the more reliable our findings are. And then I'm really excited to begin using these findings to, tailor our services or our resources and our outreach approaches to reach students, in disaggregated ways, tailor our services and our approach, to meet needs of specific groups of students. So really looking forward to putting the research into action.
Thank you. I have so many questions for you, but in the interest of time, I will move along to the next, and maybe I'll contact you afterwards. Devin and Yi?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in here. Every library assessment conference, I walk away with probably more possible projects to do than there were presentations. This is kind of like no end of inspiration and ideas that come out of these things. But in this specific area about library instruction, the thing about doing a curriculum mapping project over a couple of years is in a few years, we're going to have to do it again. Things will shift and we'll have to re-examine everything. But more immediately, what I'd really like to see us take a careful look at would be the shift and alignment of library instructional services with increasingly online instruction and where we fit in there, not just in terms of COVID and classes having shifted online, but there's already an increasing importance on inline instruction and entirely online programs within our school. So that would be the place I think would be really fruitful to look at.
The future is here when it comes to online education, for sure. Okay, second last group, Brianne, Lyda, and Stephanie.
Yeah, so for us, our next steps is working on a university-wide project to align our program level assessment data with the institutional learning outcomes and a larger plan of collecting assessment data at the institutional level. So that's what we'll be working on.
And last but definitely not least, Claire.
Thanks. Three things that I'm particularly interested in focusing on this year in relation to the SDGs. We've got a commitment in our library this year to look at increasing the amount of visibility of Indigenous knowledge in our collections and to adopt more Indigenous ways of knowing and learning into our service delivery. So that's a really big focus for us. We've just signed our first read and publish agreement. So really looking forward to working with our researchers on engaging with open access publishing. And our university has recently released a modern slavery statement. And so we're looking forward to having some interesting conversations with our vendors around ensuring that our supply chains in the provision of digital resources actually comply with those requirements. So some really interesting opportunities for us to engage in this social justice agenda this year.
Thank you so much. And with that, we come to the end of this, and this being the last, we come to the end of the 2020 Library Assessment Conference. And I just realized I get the privilege of closing out the 2020 Library Assessment Conference. And I promise I'll make it brief because we're a few minutes over. Thank you all so much for your presentations today, and to the audience. Thank you for staying with us, and thanks to everyone else who presented at one of the 5 previous sessions of this hastily put together virtual conference, which was supposed to be an in-person conference last October in Chicago. The steering committee is working on publishing the proceedings of this conference, as well as the recordings of all of the sessions. Thank you for making this an enriching and inspiring experience despite the circumstances. And we hope to see you again in person or virtually in 2022. Thank you, and have a good evening or morning, depending on where you are. Bye, everyone.
Bye.